The water barely moves. A broad plain of silt-brown river spreads out beneath a low sun, draining slowly toward a warm sea that no longer exists. This is the northern edge of Africa, roughly 97 million years ago, and the shallow channels in front of you run warm as bath water. Something rises from the surface without a sound. A long ridge of skin and bone, taller than a grown man, catches the last of the light and holds it. Below that ridge, a narrow snout rests at the waterline, as still as a floating log. From the tip of that snout to the end of the tail, this animal measures more than 49 feet. It is the longest predatory dinosaur that science has ever found. Settle in for a moment and let the day drain out of you the way this river drains toward the sea. There is no hurry here. We have 100 million years to cross, and we will cross them slowly, one warm channel at a time. You have nowhere to be but here, at the edge of the water, watching a giant breathe. The giant has a name, though it took the modern world a long time to learn it: aegyptiacus, the spined lizard of Egypt. It belongs to a slice of deep time called the Cenomanian, the opening stage of the late Cretaceous, which ran from roughly 100 to 94 million years ago. That is the world you're standing in now. Flowering plants have already spread across the continents. The great sauropods still walk the drier ground inland, and here, along these warm African waterways, a sail-backed hunter moves through water that reaches to its knees, then to its belly, then closes soft and brown over its flanks. Look at the sail first, you cannot help it. A row of tall spines runs down the animal's back, bony blades growing straight up out of the vertebrae. The longest of them stand over 5.5 feet tall on their own. They are more than 10 times the width of the little bones they rise from, which is a strange and top-heavy piece of engineering. Stretched between them, most likely, was a web of skin, so the whole back became a single standing surface. Imagine walking up to the base of a stairwell and craning your neck to see the top of the wall a full story above you. That is the height you would tip your head back to take in if you stood beside this sail at the water's edge. What the sail was for, nobody can tell you with certainty. This is the first of many honest gaps you will meet tonight, so let it settle gently rather than nag at you. Some researchers think the sail shed or gathered heat, a great flag of skin for warming in the sun or cooling in the shade. Others suspect it was for display, a signal to rivals or to mates, the way a peacock's tail says everything before a single step is taken. A few have argued it anchored a hump of fat like the high withers of a bison. Still others picture it slicing the water like the tall dorsal fin of a sailfish, steadying the body against a current. No single idea has been proven, and no single idea has been ruled out. The sail simply stands there in the low light, keeping its purpose to itself. Now let your eye travel forward, along the neck to the head. This is where the animal stops looking like the dinosaurs of your childhood and starts looking like something else. The skull is long and narrow, between about 5 and nearly 6 feet from back to snout tip. It is not the deep, boxy, bone-crushing head of a tyrant. It is a crocodile's profile grafted onto a dinosaur, low and tapering, with jaws that end in a slight rounded spoon. Picture your own forearm laid down from fingertip to elbow, and then laid down again end to end. 2 of those lengths, roughly, is how far this snout runs. The teeth complete the picture. They are straight and conical and smooth, without the steak knife serrations that most large meat-eaters carry. There are 6 or 7 of them set into each side of the very front of the upper jaw, and about a dozen more running back along each upper edge behind them. Teeth like these are not built to saw through flesh and bone. They are built to grip, to pin something slick and thrashing so it cannot twist free. Run the tip of your tongue along the smooth back of your own front teeth, and you have the shape in mind. Now grow it to the length of a railroad spike, and set rows of them in a jaw longer than a doorway is wide. Hold that image, because it is a clue and a puzzle at the same time. A crocodile's head, Agrippa's teeth, a body longer than a city bus, wading in a warm river at the close of a Cenomanian day. Everything about the animal seems to point toward the water, and yet, as you will learn across the hours ahead, how deeply this giant belonged to the water is one of the most stubborn arguments in the whole of modern paleontology. We will not settle it tonight. We will only walk carefully around it, the way you would walk around the edge of a lagoon you could not see the bottom of. For now, pull your gaze back from the single animal and let the whole world open up around it, because the river is the real character here, and the giant is only its largest resident. This was a delta country, a vast low plain where rivers slowed and split and spread before giving themselves up to the ancient Tethys Sea. The Tethys was a broad tropical ocean that once separated the northern and southern land masses, and its warm shallows lapped against this shore. The rivers came down toward it in braided ropes, channel dividing from channel, then rejoining, then dividing again, laying down bar after bar of pale sediment. Between the channels lay tidal flats that shone when the water pulled back. Standing pools ranged from fresh to brackish, salted by the nearness of the sea. Low green vegetation crowded the banks, something like the mangroves that fringe warm coast today, their roots holding the mud together against the pull of the tide. The air is thick and humid and warm. There is a smell to it, the green rot of a productive wetland, mud and leaf and fish and standing water under a strong sun. Overhead, pterosaurs wheel on the rising heat, some of them very large, their leathery wings tilting as they scan the shallows below. The light comes off the water in a hard, wide glare, scattering across silt-brown surfaces so shallow you could wade a long way out before the bottom fell from under you. This is not a quiet, empty backdrop. It is one of the richest, busiest landscapes the Cretaceous ever built, a machine for making life on an enormous scale. Geologists have 2 great windows onto this vanished country, and both of them carry the names of the places where the rocks still lie. One is the Kem Group, a band of red and tan cliffs in southeastern Morocco, near the border with Algeria, where wind and time have cut the old riverbeds open to the sky. The other is the Bahariya Formation, a set of layers exposed in the Bahariya oasis, out in the western desert of Egypt. Both are Cenomanian in age, both preserve the same kind of river delta world, and both, as you will hear, are woven directly into the tangled human tale of how this dinosaur was found, lost, and found again. Spend a moment on how crowded that world was, because it is genuinely strange. In most landscapes you can name today, one great predator sits at the top, and the ecosystem arranges itself carefully beneath it. A lion range does not stack 3 more lion-sized hunters on top of the lions, but the Kem and Bahariya rivers seem to have supported several giant meat-eaters at once, sharing the same water and the same banks. Alongside Spinosaurus lived Taurus saharicus, a shark-toothed hunter as long as a house is wide, with a skull well over 4.5 feet long. There was the lighter, faster Deltadromeus. There were smaller theropods too, among them an abelisaurid called Rugops, whose snout was pierced by a row of large openings for blood vessels and nerves, possibly feeding some structure of display skin across its face. That is an unusual amount of a large predator to fit into one food web, and paleontologists have long puzzled over how the river fed them all. Part of the answer almost certainly lies in the water itself, which teemed with prey the size of prey a giant needs. Cruising the deeper channels were coelacanths of the genus Mawsonia, heavy-bodied fish built on an ancient plan, some of them stretching beyond 17 feet, ranking among the largest bony fishes that have ever lived. Working the shallows was Onchopristis, a sawfish relative armed with a long flat snout lined with barbed teeth that jutted out to the sides. It swept that saw through schools of smaller fish, and it could grow to something like 28 feet. Its shed rostral teeth are so common in the Kem rock that they are among the first fossils a searcher there is likely to turn up. So picture the layered traffic of it. Below the surface, giant coelacanths sliding through the brown gloom of the channels. Just under the light, the sawfish relative raking its barbed snout through silver schools. Along the banks, crocodile relatives lying in the mud. Overhead, the pterosaurs turning and wading out into all of it. Snout lowered to the waterline, the sail-backed giant with the gripping teeth, feeling for a tremor in the water before its eyes have found a thing to look at. That last detail is worth slowing down for, because it is one of the most remarkable things about this animal's head. In the bone at the very tip of the snout, running through the jaw, there is a dense scatter of small openings, tiny holes that connect down into a shared internal cavity. When researchers ran modern scans through a Spinosaurid snout, they found this network and recognized it. Living crocodiles carry something like it. Those openings house pressure receptors, sensory pits that read the faintest disturbance moving through water. A crocodile can lie with its eyes closed and feel a fish brush past in the dark. A structure like that in the snout of Spinosaurus suggests the same trick, a way to hunt the murky shallows by touch and pressure rather than by sight. Imagine it gently as you drift. The giant stands with its long jaw laid flat on the surface, water beading along the smooth teeth. It is not looking, it is listening with its face. A fish flicks its tail somewhere out in the brown haze, and the pressure of that flick spreads outward in a ring too faint for any eye. The snout feels it arrive. The head is already turning before a single ripple reaches the water's edge where you stand. There is more evidence that pulls this animal toward the water, and we will lay it all out in the hours to come, carefully and slowly, giving each piece its due. There is the shape of the teeth, made for holding slippery prey. There is chemistry locked in the tooth enamel, ratios of oxygen that sit closer to the values found in turtles and crocodiles than in ordinary land-dwelling dinosaurs, read by some scientists as a signature of a life spent partly submerged. There is direct, almost intimate proof of diet. A Spinosaurus tooth found lodged in the vertebra of a big fish, and an acid-etched fish scale recovered from inside a Spinosaurid's rib cage, the last meal turned to stone. And there is the tail, which we will come to, a deep, flexible blade of a tail unlike that of any other known meat-eating dinosaur that some researchers believe drove this giant through open water. But you should also know this early and this plainly that not everyone reads those clues the same way. A serious group of scientists looks at the very same bones and sees something else entirely. They picture an animal too buoyant and too unsteady to dive, a giant that waded and stood at the shoreline and struck at fish from the edge, like an impossibly huge heron, rather than swimming out after them like an otter. The bones support both stories. That is not a failure of the science. It is the honest shape of the science, and holding two possibilities at once is part of what it means to think clearly about a creature no living eye has ever seen. For now, let the debate rest, and let the animal simply be what it plainly is, enormous and strange and hard to measure. Even that last word, measure, opens onto uncertainty. Ask how long Spinosaurus really was, and you will get a range rather than an answer. Some careful studies put it between about 41 and 47 feet. One widely cited description called it over 49 feet, the figure you met at the water's edge tonight. Another estimate pushed it toward the region of 53 to 59 feet. A more recent reassessment argued for a smaller maximum, closer to 46 feet. Ask how much it weighed, and the range grows wider still, running from roughly 4 tons at the light end to nearly 21 tons at the heavy end. That is one of the broadest weight spreads of any famous dinosaur, a measure not of carelessness, but of how little of this animal we have ever held in our hands, and how little we hold is the heart of the strangeness. Most dinosaurs you can name are known from bones you could go and stand in front of, mounted under museum lights, real and touchable. Dinosaurus, for most of the last century, was known mainly from drawings and notes about bones that no longer exist. The first good remains were dug from the Egyptian desert and carried across the sea to Europe, described and named, and then, on a single night in the middle of a human war, destroyed. For 60 years afterward, the longest predator ever found was a ghost on paper, a set of careful sketches and a scatter of photographs, and a scientist's insistence that he had once seen the thing whole. So hold the picture we have built. The warm silt-brown delta draining toward the Tethys, the braided channels and the mangrove-fringed banks and the shining tidal flat, the pterosaurs turning overhead, the giant coelacanths in the deep water, the barbed sawfish in the shallows, the rival giants shimmering along the distant tree line, and in the middle of it all, the sail standing tall against the low sun, the long crocodile head laid soft on the surface, the smooth teeth waiting, the snout feeling for a life it cannot yet see. A whole living world, warm and loud and crowded, roughly 97 million years before anyone would come along to wonder about it. That world sank in the end the way all such worlds do. The channels shifted and buried their own beds. Mud hardened into rock around the bones of the things that had died there. The sea advanced and retreated. Continents drifted apart, carrying the two great fossil grounds, Morocco and Egypt, into the dry desert light where they wait today. The delta became stone, and the stone kept its secrets for tens of millions of years, patient and silent, until a few determined people went out into the heat with picks and brushes and began very slowly to read them. So much of the animal you can picture in the dark was borrowed from its cousins. When the river giant itself was scattered, half buried or lost, scientists reached sideways. They found smaller relatives, better preserved and more complete, and they used those bodies to guess at the missing one. To rebuild a creature you have never seen whole, you study the ones you can hold. Start in what is now Niger, in rock called the Elraz Formation. The time is the Aptian age of the early Cretaceous, roughly 112 million years ago. Out of that ground came a spinosaurid named Suchomimus tenerensis, described by Paul Sereno and his colleagues in 1998. Its name means crocodile mimic, and the skull earned it. Long, low, and narrow, the jaw lined with conical teeth. It was a face built for closing on something wet and struggling, not for slicing flesh from bone. Suchomimus was large, though not a giant. Length estimates run from about 31 to 36 feet, nose to tail. Picture that against something your body already knows. It was longer than a school bus, and it carried a tall ridge along its lower back, a low echo of the sail its famous relative would raise. On each hand it wore a great curved claw, a hook of bone as long as a grown person's forearm, the kind of tool you would want for pinning a slippery fish against a riverbed. For the scientists trying to imagine Spinosaurus, Suchomimus mattered less for its drama than for its completeness. Here was a Spinosaurid preserved well enough to measure, limb by limb, joint by joint. You could take the proportions of this animal, the ratio of skull to spine, of arm to leg, and scale them up toward the fragments of the larger cousin. Along with the English relative Baryonyx, Suchomimus became a ruler laid against a shadow. Much of the earliest weight and shape estimates for the river giant leaned on measurements taken from this crocodile mimic of Niger, and Suchomimus carried a warning inside its bone, though the warning would not be read for decades. In 2022, a study of bone density across some 250 to 300 living and extinct animals looked closely at these relatives. Spinosaurus and Baryonyx, it found, had nearly solid limb bones, dense and marrow-free, the kind seen in penguins and hippos, bodies that spend real time underwater. But Suchomimus did not. Its bones were hollow, filled with air, built like those of an ordinary land dinosaur. The lesson was quiet and important. Even within one family, even among close kin sharing the same river habits, the deep specializations were not shared alike. You cannot assume every cousin lived the same life just because their faces rhymed. Now cross an ocean that did not yet exist as it does today, to northeastern Brazil, to a basin called the Araripe. The rock here is the Romualdo Formation, and its age overlaps closely with the African relatives Aptian into Albion, somewhere around 110 to 100 million years ago. From this ground came one of the strangest specimens in the whole family, a Spinosaurid named Irritator challengeri. Its skull is one of the most complete spinosaurid skulls ever found, and by that alone it should have been a gift. Instead, it arrived carrying a lie. Before any scientist studied it, the fossil had passed through the hands of commercial dealers, and those dealers had reworked it. They packed plaster into the snout and reshaped it, lengthening the profile, sharpening the drama, making the animal look more impressive than the bone alone allowed. They were dressing a fossil to sell. Think of it this way: face reshaped with wet putty, pressed and smoothed by a stranger's thumb, moulded not toward the truth of the animal, but toward the fiercer creature a buyer might pay more to own. When the researchers finally cleared the plaster away and found the real bone beneath the sculpture, their reaction gave the animal its name. Irritator comes from their irritation at the tampering, the slow, careful work of undoing someone else's forgery before the science could even begin. The second name, challengeri, is lighter. It honours Professor Challenger, the blustering explorer from Arthur Conan Doyle's novel of a lost prehistoric world. Beneath the plaster was a real and useful creature. Irritator is estimated at roughly 20 to 26 feet in length, mid-sized for the family, with the same long fish-trapping jaw. Because its skull survived so nearly whole, it became a reference for the parts of the river giant that were only known as scrap: the shape of the palate, the set of the teeth, the curve of the snout in profile. When you have only a broken jaw of the animal you want, a complete jaw from a cousin becomes precious. Irritator gave scientists a spinosaurid head they could actually turn over in their hands, once they had scraped the dealer's fiction off its face. There is something worth sitting with there, in the quiet. The picture we hold of these ancient animals is not just carved by time and stone, it is shaped by every hand the fossil passes through, honest and dishonest alike. A creature dead for 100 million years can still be flattered, disguised, sold, and only slowly returned to its true proportions by people patient enough to distrust what they were handed. Wherever you're drifting tonight, follow or subscribe wherever you are listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice. The river and its cousins will still be here. Not every relative that helps fill in the picture belonged to the same family. Some were simply neighbours, sharing the same drowned world, and they matter because they teach scientists how to read a skull, stay in Niger, in that same Elraz formation, and meet Rugops primus, described by Paul Sereno and Stephen Broussard in 2008. Rugops was not a spinosaurid at all. It belonged to a different branch of meat-eaters called abelisaurids, and it was much smaller. Its skull only about 12.5 inches long, roughly the length of your forearm from wrist to elbow. A modest head, blunt and short, nothing like the long crocodile jaws of the fish-eaters. But that small skull carried a detail that made paleontologists lean in close. Along the top of the snout ran a paired row of large openings in the bone, called foramina. In life, blood vessels and nerves threaded through those channels, feeding something on the surface of the face. The same feature turns up in other abelisaurids, and its presence hints at soft tissue that no longer survives. Some kind of specialized skin, perhaps, or a display structure, a crest or a patch of tissue used to signal to others of its kind. You cannot see the skin. You can only read the plumbing left in the bone and reason back toward what it once fed. It is honest to call that a maybe, not a certainty. The openings are real and countable. What sat on top of them is inference held gently. That is the deeper reason a small, unglamorous skull like the one from Rugops earns its place in this account. It teaches the method. When the river giant's own head was too incomplete to trust, scientists learned to interpret theropod skulls by comparison, foramen by foramen, socket by socket, reading nerves and vessels as clues to the flesh they served. The face of the great sail-backed hunter, its scattered snout riddled with its own openings for pressure-sensing tissue, was reconstructed in part by this patient cross-checking habit of mine laid against relatives near and far. So gather them up, the cousins and the neighbours. Suchomimus of Niger, 30-odd feet of crocodile mimic with hollow air-filled bones and great hooked claws. Irritator of Brazil, its complete skull recovered from beneath a dealer's plaster mask. Rugops, small and blunt, its snout stitched with the openings of some vanished display. None of them is the river giant. Yet for years, when the giant was only a rumour of enormous spines and a shattered jaw, these were the animals that gave it a body. Their proportions became its proportions. Their solid or hollow bones raised the first careful questions about how it lived. Their preserved skulls stood in for the head no museum any longer held. That is how you rebuild a lost animal. You do not conjure it from nothing. You measure its living relatives, you weigh their bones, you read the small openings in their faces, and you scale honestly, admitting where the ruler stops and the guessing begins. The picture is always a composite, always provisional, always waiting for the next better fossil to correct it. But the cousins can only take you so far. They can lend a jaw, a claw, a ratio of limb to spine. They cannot tell you who first pulled the river giant itself out of the ground, or how the only skeleton of it ever assembled came to exist and then came to vanish. For that, you have to leave the crocodile mimics of Niger and the plaster-masked skull of Brazil behind. But to know how we ever found this river giant, you have to go back to a young German scientist and a fossil hunter working the Egyptian desert more than a century ago. But to know how we ever found this river giant, you have to go back to a young German scientist and a fossil hunter working the Egyptian desert more than a century ago. The young German scientist was named Ernst Stromer von Reichenbach, and long before there was a debate about how this animal lived, there was only a man, a desert, and a hunch. He was a paleontologist from Bavaria, careful, patient, drawn to places other collectors overlooked. Where many of his peers were combing the fossil beds of North America, Stromer looked the other way, across the Mediterranean, toward the great dry interior of Egypt. He believed the deserts there held the remains of a lost African world, a world of Cretaceous life almost no one had touched. He was right, but he could not have guessed how strange and how sorrowful the finding would become. To reach those bones, Stromer needed someone who could live in the desert for months at a time. He found that man in Richard Markgraf, a fossil collector of extraordinary skill and endurance. Markgraf was not a wealthy academic. He was a working hunter of ancient things, thin, often ill, moving through the Egyptian oases with camels and hand tools and a good eye for the pale gleam of fossil bone against sandstone. Stromer arranged the funding, much of it through the Bavarian Academy of Sciences in Munich, and Markgraf did the walking, the digging, the wrapping, the long labour under a sun that could push the air well past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Picture the place they were working. The Bahariya oasis lies in Egypt's western desert, a low green depression ringed by cliffs and dunes, hundreds of miles from the sea. In the autumn of 1912, Markgraf was crossing ground that had once been something entirely different. 90-some million years earlier, in the Cenomanian age, this had been a coastal lowland threaded with rivers, a warm, humid delta draining toward an ancient sea. The rock still remembered it. In those tan and rust-coloured beds, Markgraf began to pull free a set of bone unlike anything in the standard picture of a meat-eating dinosaur. There was a piece of lower jaw, long and narrow, more like the jaw of a crocodile than the deep, box-like skull of the great land predator. There were teeth, but they were wrong for a hunter of large game. They were straight, smooth-sided cones, unserrated without the steak-knife edges that other big theropods carried, and there were vertebrae, backbones, from which rose the strangest structures of all, tall blade-like spines of bone, some of them more than 3 feet long, far taller than the vertebrae they grew from. Markgraf had, without quite knowing it, uncovered the sail of a river giant. He packed these fragments as he packed everything, with the patience of a man who understood that a bone lost in transit was a bone lost forever. Wrapped, crated, and shipped across the Mediterranean, the Bahariya fossils made their slow way north to Munich, into Stromer's hands and into the collections of the Bavarian State Collection of Paleontology. There, over the next few years, Stromer studied them with the close attention they deserved. He measured, he compared, he drew, and slowly he understood that he was holding a creature that belonged in no existing category. In 1915, Stromer published his description, and he gave the animal its name, Saurus aegyptiacus, the spined lizard from Egypt. The name honoured the single feature that had struck him first, those enormous neural spines rising from the back. He recognised even from these incomplete remains that the animal had been huge, larger, in fact, than a dinosaur that had been named only a few years earlier on the other side of the Atlantic. Tyrannosaurus rex, described in 1905, had already taken its place as the era's great symbol of predatory size. And here, from fragmentary jaws and vertebrae and those improbable spines, Stromer could tell that his Egyptian animal had been longer still. Think about what that meant in 1915. The most famous flesh-eater in the world had just been crowned, and a quiet Bavarian scientist was calmly noting that his African fossil outreached it. He did not have a complete skeleton. He had a jaw, teeth, ribs, vertebrae, and those sail spines, enough to sketch the outline of something extraordinary and no more. But even that outline told him this had been one of the largest predators ever to walk the earth. He described it, he named it, and he set it into the scientific record. And then the animal settled into the museum drawers of Munich to wait. It is worth pausing on the kind of man Ernst Stromer was, because the fate of these bones is tangled up with his character. He was, by the accounts that survive, precise, private, and stubborn in the ways that matter. He came from an old and respected Bavarian family. He built a career on the fossils of Egypt, returning to that African material again and again, describing not only Spinosaurus but other giants of the same ancient river world. In 1931 he named Carcharodontosaurus, another enormous predator from the same bed, and a long-necked sauropod he called Aegyptiacus. Together these formed a picture of a vanished ecosystem, a crowded African Cretaceous full of monsters, preserved nowhere else on Earth in quite this way. But Stromer lived into a dark chapter of German history, and he did not bend to it. When the Nazi regime rose, he refused to fall in line. He was openly opposed to it, and he paid for that opposition. He was pushed out of his university position. His standing eroded, his voice diminished in the institutions he had served for decades. He had 3 sons, and the war would take a terrible toll on his family. This was not a man who moved with the current. He was a scientist who valued truth over comfort, and in a time when that stance was dangerous, he held it anyway. His fossils, meanwhile, remained where he had placed them, in the Bavarian State Collection of Paleontology in Munich. The only known skeleton of Spinosaurus in all the world sat in that building, catalogued and drawn and photographed, the single physical anchor for everything anyone knew about the animal. There were no casts distributed to other museums, no duplicate specimens waiting in a second city. Everything ran through Munich, and as the war deepened, Munich became a target. Before we walk into that night, let me leave one small thread with you, softly, the way you would set something down beside the bed. If these long, slow journeys through deep time are the kind of thing that helps you drift off, you can follow or subscribe wherever you are listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice. That is all. Now let the room go quiet again, and let us go back to the fossils in their drawers, unaware of what was coming. By the early 1940s, Ernst Stromer understood that the war was closing in on the city that held his life's work. He was not a naive man. He could see the raids intensifying over German cities, could imagine what a single incendiary strike would do to a building full of paper-labeled wooden cabinets and irreplaceable bone. And so he did the reasonable thing, the thing any careful custodian would do. He asked. He went to the director of the collection and requested that the fossils be moved to safety, out of the city, somewhere the bombs could not reach them. He was refused. The director, by the account that has come down to us, did not believe the collection was in real danger. The prevailing confidence was that the Luftwaffe would protect Munich, that the city's skies would hold, that the fossils were safest exactly where they sat. It was a judgment made in good faith, and grounded in a faith that would not survive the war. Stromer pressed, and the answer stayed the same. The bones remained in Munich. The only skeleton of the longest predatory dinosaur ever found stayed in a building that its own guardians believed was untouchable. On the night of the 24th of April 1944, and into the early hours of the 25th, that belief was answered. An Allied bombing raid came over Munich in the dark. Among the many buildings struck was the Bavarian State Collection of Paleontology. Incendiary bombs found the halls where Stromer's Egyptian fossils were kept, and fire took the rest. The collection burned. And in that fire, the only known skeleton of Spinosaurus aegyptiacus, the jaw markgraph had lifted from Bahariya more than 30 years earlier, the teeth, the rib, vertebrae, the tall sails, spines, all of it was destroyed. It was not only Spinosaurus. The same night erased Aegyptosaurus, the long-necked sauropod Stromer had named from the same African beds. It took the original bones of Carcharodontosaurus, the other great predator of that river world. Decades of field work, the physical evidence of an entire lost ecosystem, went out of existence in a few hours of fire. What Markgraf had carried out of the desert by camel, what Stromer had studied and measured and named, was reduced to ash in a burning museum, a continent away from the ground it came from. Consider how total that loss was. Most of what science knows, it knows through objects that can be checked again. A fossil is a promise that the evidence will still be there when the next researcher comes to look, to remeasure, to test an old claim with a new method. That is how the discipline corrects itself, by returning to the bone. But on that April night, the bone was gone. There was no returning to it. Every future question about the original Spinosaurus, every measurement someone might have wanted to take, every scan a later technology might have offered, all of it was foreclosed at once. Here is a way to feel the completeness of it. Imagine a child's sandcastle built low on a wide beach, shaped with real care over a long afternoon, every tower patted smooth, every wall pressed firm. Then a single wave, no larger than the others, slides up the sand and draws back, and where the castle stood there is only flat, wet, shining ground. Not damaged, not partly there, simply gone, as if it had never been raised. That is what the one and only skeleton of Spinosaurus became on that night, taken whole by a single incoming wave of fire, leaving the beach smooth behind it. What survived was not the animal, but the record of the man who had studied it. Stromer had done his work thoroughly, in the way of a scientist who trusted that careful documentation was worth the labour. He had written detailed notes. He had commissioned and drawn precise illustrations of the bones, their proportions, their strange elongated spines. There were photographs. There were published descriptions from 1915 and the years after. These pages, scattered across archives and journals and personal papers, had not been in the burning hall, or had been copied, or existed as ink on paper far from Munich. And so the paper outlived the bone. But paper is not the same as a fossil, and every scientist knows it. A drawing can show you what one observer saw and chose to record. It cannot be rescanned. It cannot be sectioned to reveal the density of the bone inside. It cannot be handled and turned and compared, joint by joint, against a specimen found 70 years later. When you lose the object and keep only the image, you keep an interpretation, frozen at the moment it was made, unable to answer any question its author did not already think to ask. The drawings of Spinosaurus were excellent. They were also suddenly all there was. Ernst Stromer lived to see this happen. He survived the war, though it cost him dearly. 2 of his 3 sons did not come home. He had opposed a regime, been stripped of his position for it, and then watched the physical fruit of his scientific life burn in the city he had entrusted it to, after his own warning had been set aside. He had asked for the fossils to be moved. He had been told they were safe. There is a particular grief in being right about a danger and unable to prevent it, in carrying a warning that no one acted on until the thing you feared had already come to pass. For paleontology, the destruction created a strange and lasting gap. Spinosaurus became a creature known almost entirely from second-hand evidence, a giant whose existence no one doubted but whose bones no one could touch. It sat in textbooks as a name and a reconstruction based on Stromer's figures, a sail-backed silhouette drawn from lost originals. Generations of readers met the animal only through these inherited outlines, a predator larger than Tyrannosaurus that existed in the physical world as ash and archive. Whole ideas about how it looked and lived rested on a foundation that had already been destroyed, and the questions were real ones. How long was it exactly if the jaw and spines that might have settled the argument were gone? How were these strange conical teeth arranged along that narrow snout? What did the rest of the skeleton, the limbs, the hips, the tail actually look like when Stromer had never had a complete one to begin with, and now no one ever would from that specimen? The fire did not just take a skeleton. It took the ability to answer from the original material nearly everything future science would most want to ask. There is something almost unbearable in the timing of it. Mark Graff had found these bones in 1912 in the quiet of a desert oasis and carried them out with immense effort. Stromer had studied them through the upheavals of one world war and named them in the middle of it in 1915. For nearly 3 decades they had rested safely in Munich, surviving one war entirely intact. And then, near the end of a second, in a single night, they were undone. The animal had waited 90 million years as a rock to be found. It lasted 32 years in human hands before it was lost again. You can follow the whole arc of it and feel the shape of the loss. A warm African delta buries a giant. The rock holds it through unimaginable spans of time, through the rise and fall of every landscape that followed. A patient collector lifts it into the light. A careful scientist gives it a name and a place in the record. And then human violence, the kind that had already driven that scientist from his post, reaches into a museum and takes it back more completely than any flood or drought or slow erosion ever could. The desert had preserved it, the city could not. So this is where the animal stood after that April night, in the ledger of what science actually possessed. There was a name, Spinosaurus aegyptiacus, formally established and secure. There were Stromer's published descriptions from 1950. There were his notes and his drawings and a handful of photographs, careful and skilled and utterly irreplaceable. And there was nothing else. No jaw to remeasure, no vertebra to section, no sail spine to hold up to the light and wonder at. The physical creature had passed out of the world a second time, and the paper record was left to carry the entire weight of it. For a long stretch afterward, that was simply the situation, accepted and unchanged. Spinosaurus was the great predator you could read about but never examine, a giant defined by its own absence. Anyone who wanted to work on it had to begin with the same limited inheritance. Stromer's figures and words and reason outward from there, hoping the desert somewhere held more. The animal became a kind of scientific ghost, present in every book on prehistoric predators, absent from every collection drawer, real and reachable at the same time. Travel north and back for a moment, out of the African heat into a grey morning in the south of England, January of 1983. A working clay pit called Smoke Jacks, near the village of Ockley in Surrey. Its floor a heavy blue-grey mud called field clay, laid down in a Cretaceous floodplain roughly 130 million years ago. An amateur fossil collector named William Walker is picking his slow way across the spoil, the sort of patient hobbyist who reads the ground the way other people read a page, and in a fallen block of that clay he finds a single claw. Not a tooth, not a scrap of rib, a claw. Enormous, curved, longer than his hand, its outer edge sweeping in a smooth arc from base to point. The tip is broken off and missing, so at first he does not have the whole thing. He gathers the pieces, brings the block home, and eventually the missing tip is recovered from the pit as well. Reassembled, the outer curve of that claw measures about 12 inches, roughly the span of a dinner plate. Picture the rim of such a plate lifted from the table and set on its edge. That same slow sweep of the curve, and imagine hooking one finger over it and feeling the weight pull your hand down. That is the object a hobbyist carried home in a bag. He took it to the Natural History Museum in London, and this is where the detective work begins, because a claw by itself tells you almost nothing and almost everything at once. It was plainly a hand claw, an ungual, the bony core that in life wore a sheath of horn and would have been larger still. Its size alone announced a very big animal, but nothing quite like it had come out of English rock before. Two paleontologists at the museum, Alan Charig and Angela Milner, took up the puzzle, and rather than guess from the single bone, they did the patient thing. They went back to the pit and they dug. What came out of the wheeled clay over the following months was not another lonely fragment. It was a skeleton, one of the most complete, large, predatory dinosaurs ever found in Europe. Vertebrae, ribs, much of the skull, the long bones of the limbs, the bones of the hand that the great claw belonged to. Slowly the shape of the animal emerged from the blue mud, and it was a strange shape, unlike the familiar meat-eaters with their deep, hatchet-like heads. This creature had a long, low skull, narrow and almost crocodile-like, and its snout ended in a rounded expansion set with conical teeth. It was built plainly for a different kind of hunting than the textbook predators of the time. In 1986, in the journal Nature, Charig and Milner gave it a name, Baryonyx walkeri. The genus means heavy claw, from the fossil that started everything, and the species name honours William Walker, the collector who spotted it. So the whole tremendous animal now carries, in its formal name, the memory of one enthusiast on one cold morning bending down over a block of clay. That is worth resting on for a breath. The largest predatory dinosaur skeleton found in Britain was named for an amateur. The size, once the bones were laid out, was substantial without being monstrous. Estimates put Baryonyx at something like 25 to 33 feet from snout to tail, and its weight somewhere in the range of 1 1/3 to a little over 2 tons, longer than a delivery van, heavier than a small car, walking on 2 legs along the margins of a Cretaceous river. Large, but not the outsized giant its African cousins would prove to be, and crucially, the specimen was not fully grown. The animal in the clay was a subadult, still adding length, which means the adults of its kind reached larger still. What made Baryonyx matter was never really its size. It was what the bones could prove about how it lived. And here is the part of this English discovery that would reach all the way back to the sands of Egypt and forward into every argument about the river giant. Inside the rib cage of that skeleton, in the region where the stomach would have sat, the excavators found the remains of the animal's last meals, not inferred, not modelled, actual food, fossilized in place. There were fish scales and fish bones, etched and partly dissolved as though by stomach acid, from a large freshwater fish of the kind that swam those Wealden rivers, direct physical evidence that this long-snouted predator ate fish. That alone would have been a landmark, the first really solid proof that any dinosaur habitually fished. But there was more in the gut region, and it complicates the tidy picture in exactly the way real evidence tends to. Alongside the fish remains lay a bone from a young iguanodon, a plant-eating dinosaur, one of the common large herbivores of that same landscape. Whether Baryonyx killed the juvenile itself or scavenged a carcass, the museum team could not say for certain, and they were careful to say so. But the meaning was plain enough. This was not a pure fish specialist that never touched anything else. Here was an animal with fish in its belly and a land-dwelling dinosaur in its belly at the same time. A mixed diet preserved in a single body. A fisher, yes, but an opportunist too, taking what the river and its banks provided. Let that finding settle, because it changes how you read everything that comes after. If you are still with me here in the quiet, follow or subscribe wherever you're listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice, and let the calm carry you while the pieces come together. For decades, the notion that a dinosaur might have eaten fish rested mostly on the peculiar shape of certain skulls and teeth. Long jaws, cone-shaped teeth without the steak knife serrations of typical predators, the sort of architecture you see in animals that grip slippery prey rather than saw through flesh. It was a reasonable inference. But inference is not proof, and for the great African sailback, whose only skeleton had long since been lost, inference was very nearly all anyone had. You could argue that a crocodile-shaped snout meant a fish-eater, and someone else could argue that it did not, and there was no belly full of scales to settle it. Baryonyx settled it. Or rather, Baryonyx gave the whole idea a body to stand on. Here was a close relative, a member of the same family of long-snouted predators, caught in the act, its last meal still inside it. Fish and a young plant-eater side by side. Once you had that, the strange snout and the conical teeth of the larger, older, lost animal read differently. They stopped looking like a curiosity and started looking like the tools of a known way of life, a lineage of dinosaurs that worked the water's edge. The English fossil, dug from a commercial clay pit by two museum scientists following a hobbyist's claw, became the key that unlocked the reading of bones found a continent away and decades apart. You can see the shape of the detective story now, and how neatly it runs in parallel. In one country, a single spectacular bone leads to a careful excavation, a nearly complete skeleton and hard evidence of diet, all of it safe in a museum drawer, all of it available to study, argue over and photograph for as long as anyone cares to look. Two patient describers who went back and dug rather than guessing. A name that remembers the finder, a gut full of proof, and in the other country, an earlier discovery of an even larger animal of the same strange kind, first drawn from the ground before the First World War, described with real care, recognized at once as something longer than the famous tyrant of North America, a creature that should have been the crown of the collection. That skeleton, though, would not wait quietly in a drawer for later scientists to test their ideas against. Its fate ran the opposite way from the English claw, where baryonyx was found, dug, kept, and read. The older giant was found, described, and then lost, its bones scattered by history before anyone could put a fish scale to the question of what it ate. So when paleontologists in the 1980s and after wanted to argue that the sail-backed giant fished the rivers of the ancient Sahara, they could no longer walk to a case and lift out its jaws. They reached instead for the English cousin, for Walker's claw and the belly full of scale, and for a growing family of long-snouted relatives found across 3 continents, and they built the case for the lost animal out of the found ones. The heavy claw from a Surrey clay pit helped reconstruct the habits of a predator whose own skeleton no scientist alive had ever touched, which returns us gently to the fundamental strangeness at the centre of all of it. Baryonyx you can visit, you can stand before the mounted bones and the great curved claw, and know that the object is real, present, weighable. The larger animal, the true subject of this long night, offered no such comfort to the people trying to understand it. They had a name, given in 1915. They had drawings and photographs and pages of careful description in an old German scientific volume. What they did not have, and would not have for the better part of a century, was the thing itself. The only skeleton was ash, and for 60 years the longest predator ever found existed almost entirely as a handful of drawings. The only skeleton was ash, and for 60 years the longest predator ever found existed almost entirely as a handful of drawings. Think for a moment about what that leaves you holding. A creature longer than a city bus, and the whole of it reduced to ink on paper, to a few grainy photographs, to the careful measurements of a man who had watched his own life's work carried toward a fire he could not stop. Stromer's plates showed the tall spines rising off the back. They showed the long, narrow jaw, the scattered vertebrae, the shape of a shoulder. But paper cannot be weighed. Paper cannot be scanned, or sliced into thin sections, or laid down beside a living animal for comparison. For 6 decades, Spinosaurus was less a skeleton than a rumour, a silhouette half-remembered from a book, argued over by people who had never touched a single real bone of it. And in that emptiness, The arguments grew strange and confident, the way arguments always do when there is nothing solid to correct them. Reconstructions came and went. Some artists gave the animal the body of a typical big meat-eater, a Tyrannosaurus with a sail bolted onto its spine and a crocodile's head grafted onto its neck. It looked plausible enough. It looked like the other giants people already knew. But plausible is not the same as true, and the honest answer, the one working scientists kept returning to, was that nobody actually knew what the body between those famous spines looked like. The middle of the animal was a blank. You were standing in a room where the most important object had been erased, and everyone was describing it from the shadow it used to cast. Then, slowly, the ground itself began to give the story back. Not in Egypt, where Stromer had worked, but a few hundred miles to the west in Morocco. There is a band of red and tan rock there called the Kem, a long escarpment of ancient river sediment that runs for many miles along the edge of the Sahara. It is the same age as the Bahariya beds, laid down in the Cenomanian roughly 100 to 94 million years ago, when this whole stretch of North Africa was not desert at all, but a vast, warm, water-threaded delta. And buried in that rock were teeth, long, straight, cone-shaped teeth without serrations, unmistakable once you knew them. Fishermen and diggers had been pulling them out of the hills for years, and the same tall-spined giant that had vanished from Munich was clearly here too, waiting in a different country under a different flag. For a long time it was fragments only. A tooth here, a snout tip there, a single vertebra, its base narrow and its spine climbing improbably high. Enough to say the animal existed, never enough to rebuild it. And then, in 2014, a team led by the paleontologist Nizar Ibrahim published a description in the journal Science that tried, for the first time in a century, to put a real body back onto those spines. The centerpiece was a partial skeleton catalogued with the label FSAC-KK, 1888. Not a full skeleton, nothing so lucky as that. But pieces from across the animal, from the skull region down through the spine and into the legs. Enough material that you could begin to reason about proportions instead of guessing at them. What that skeleton seemed to show was deeply, genuinely odd. The hind limbs came out short. Not slightly short, but startlingly so. Far shorter than you would expect on a two-legged hunter of this size. The bones themselves were dense, their interiors packed and heavy rather than hollowed out for lightness the way most dinosaur bones are. And the nostrils sat unusually far back along the snout, retracted toward the eyes instead of opening at the tip of the muzzle. Each of these features, on its own, was the kind of thing you might find in an animal that spends much of its life in water. Short legs, heavy ballast bones, nostrils pulled back so the animal can breathe while most of its face is submerged. Put them together, and the team argued for something no large predatory dinosaur had ever been reconstructed as before. They argued that Spinosaurus walked on all fours, an obligate quadruped they called it, meaning an animal that had to move on four limbs rather than choosing to. In their reconstruction, the front legs came down to bear weight, the short back legs pushed from behind, and the whole long body sat low and horizontal, built around the water rather than the land. It was a bold thing to publish, and it landed like a stone in a still pond. Here was the most famous lost dinosaur in the world, returned after 70 years of silence, and returned in a shape that broke the rules everyone thought they understood. For a while, the new picture was everywhere. It felt like a resolution. It felt like the blank middle of the animal had finally been filled in. But science is not a single announcement. It is a long argument that never quite ends, and the pushback came almost at once. Other researchers looked at the same short-legged reconstructions and were not persuaded. The biomechanicist John Hutchinson and the paleoartist and anatomist Scott Hartman were among the early skeptics, and their objection was specific and quantitative. They argued that the hinder limbs in the 2014 model had been scaled too small by a wide margin, something on the order of 27% too short. Correct that error, they said, lengthen the legs back to where the anatomy suggested they belonged, and the strange low-slung four-legged posture began to fall apart. The animal stood taller. It looked once again more like a two-legged hunter that happened to have unusual proportions, and less like a crocodile wearing a dinosaur's skull. And here the very thing that had made the discovery so exciting became its deepest weakness. That skeleton was not one clean, articulated individual pulled whole from the rock. It was assembled, pieces gathered from a site and in part from material that had passed through the hands of local fossil sellers before scientists ever saw it. Some critics questioned whether the tail and the limb bones truly belonged to the same animal as the rest of the skeleton, or whether the reconstruction had quietly stitched together bones from more than one individual, maybe even more than one kind of animal, into a single striking shape. If the legs came from a different creature than the spine, then the short-legged posture was not a discovery about Spinosaurus at all. It was an artifact of the assembly. Picture the problem in your hands. Imagine you're handed a pair of legs and told to fit them to a body you have never seen intact, and the legs come out looking wrong. Too small for the frame, forcing the whole animal into a crouch. That is the shape of the disagreement. The misscaled hind limbs sit on the skeleton like shoes, 2 sizes too small, forced onto a much larger foot, cramping the natural stance, pinching the posture into something that may never have existed in life. Straighten the toes out, give the foot a shoe that fits, and the animal stands differently. The trouble is that no one can be entirely certain which fit is the true one, because the original owner of those legs is long gone, and the reference skeleton that could have settled it burned in 1944. That is the quieter tragedy underneath all of this. Every argument about the shape of Spinosaurus is being conducted without the one specimen that could end it. Stromer's holotype, the original Egyptian skeleton, was the anchor. It was the standard against which every later scrap could be measured. And it is ash, so the science has had to proceed the way you might try to reconstruct a torn photograph, one you find in pieces scattered across 2 different rooms of an old house, a corner recovered from Egypt decades before the war, a different corner dug from Morocco most of a lifetime later. You lay the fragments down and try to guess whether they show the same fate. You hold two edges up to the light and ask whether they were ever really part of a single image, or whether you are forcing together the remains of two separate pictures because you badly want the story to be whole. That question is not idle, and it is not settled. Because the Moroccan neotype, the specimen chosen to stand in for the destroyed original and to redefine the species, may not be the same animal Stromer named at all. Some researchers, including the team behind a careful 2015 reappraisal, have pointed out that a separate name already exists for certain Moroccan material from these beds. That name is Sigilmassasaurus, coined for spinosaurid bones from the same rock, and there has been genuine debate over whether it is simply Spinosaurus by another label, or a distinct animal that lived alongside it. If some of the Moroccan bones belong to Sigilmassasaurus rather than to Spinosaurus, then the modern reconstruction is a composite in the most literal sense. A giant built partly from Egyptian memory and partly from Moroccan stone, from two countries, two rock formations, and possibly two different creatures presented to the world as one. So when you see a mounted Spinosaurus or a painting of it wading into a Cretaceous river, understand what you are actually looking at. You are looking at a hypothesis, a best current guess, assembled from fragments, corrected and recorrected, honest about its own uncertainty in a way that most museum labels do not have room to explain. This is not a failure of the science. It is the science working exactly as it should, out loud, in public, disagreeing with itself and refusing to pretend to a confidence it has not earned. The willingness to say we are not sure, to publish the doubt alongside the discovery, is the thing that separates paleontology from myth. And nowhere is that uncertainty wider than in the simplest questions you might think to ask. How big was it? How much did it weigh? These sound like the kind of things that ought to have a single number, printed in a book, agreed upon by everyone. They do not. The published length estimates for Spinosaurus scatter across a startling range. One careful analysis put the body at roughly 41 to 47 feet from snout to tail tip. The 2014 description argued for something over 49 feet, longer than any other predatory dinosaur known, and an earlier study, working from a large piece of skull, suggested a maximum reaching toward 52 to 59 feet, 16 to 18 meters, a figure so large it strains belief. Depending on which bones you trust and which method you apply, the same animal grows or shrinks by more than the length of a school bus. The weight estimates are wilder still. This is one of the widest spreads of any famous dinosaur, and it is worth sitting with just how wide. On the light end, an early estimate put the animal near 4 metric tons, something under 9,000 pounds. On the heavy end, another analysis pushed it toward nearly 21 metric tons, close to 46,000 pounds. That is not a small disagreement. That is the difference between an animal, the mass of a few large rhinos, and an animal heavier than most sauropods people picture as the true giants. When the possible weights of a creature range across a factor of 5, you are not really measuring the animal anymore. You are measuring how little of it survived, and how much room that absence leaves for reasonable people to differ. More recently, in 2022, A team led by Paul Sereno pushed back against the largest figures. Building full digital and physical models, they argued for a more modest maximum, an animal closer to 46 feet in length and around 7.5 metric tons, roughly 16,000 pounds. Still enormous. Still, quite possibly, the longest meat-eater ever to walk the earth, but not the almost mythical supergiant that some of the higher numbers implied. Their smaller, lighter Spinosaurus was not just an adjustment of the tape measure. It was tied to a very different picture of how the animal lived, one we will come back to, because the size you assign it and the life you imagine for it turn out to be two ends of the same argument. This is the strange gift of a creature known mostly from its own absence, where a complete undamaged skeleton would have pinned the numbers down and ended the debate in an afternoon. The scattered, contested remains of Spinosaurus keep the questions open decade after decade. The teeth are real. The tall spines are real. Dense bones are real. But the frame that would hold them all in fixed proportion is gone, and into that gap flows every honest disagreement about scale and shape and posture that we have walked through tonight. It is a puzzle that has resisted a final answer for more than 100 years, and it resists one still. There is something almost restful in that, if you let there be. We are so used to the idea that science hands us finished facts, clean and closed, that it can be a quiet relief to sit with one that stays open. The people who study this animal are not hiding their uncertainty from you. They are showing it to you, laying the competing skeletons side by side, telling you plainly which bones they trust and which they doubt. The reconstruction that stands in a museum hall this year may be revised in the next, and that revision will not be an embarrassment. It will be the method doing precisely what it is meant to do, correcting itself as the ground yields a little more of what it swallowed, and the ground is not finished giving. The chem beds are still still shedding teeth and vertebrae into the light of a modern sun. Somewhere in those red hills there may yet be a more complete skeleton, an individual preserved whole enough to settle the length, to fix the weight, to say once and for all whether the legs were short or long, whether the animal walked on 2 limbs or 4, whether the Moroccan bones and the Egyptian memory truly belong to one creature or two. That skeleton may already be waiting a few feet down, in rock that has kept it safe for 96 million years, and can keep it a little longer. Or it may never come. The desert is patient, and it does not answer on any schedule but its own. For now, the giant exists in the way that so many deep-time creatures exist, as a best effort, as a shape drawn in pencil and then in confident ink and then, honestly, back in pencil again. When you picture it wading into that warm delta, tail catching the low light, remember that you are picturing a work in progress. The outline is real. The details flicker. That is not the story of a failure. It is the record of 100 years of people refusing to stop asking, refusing to settle for the comfortable answer, treating a pile of broken bones with the seriousness as a whole life deserves. There is a lesson buried in the rock alongside the bones if you care to lift it out. It is that certainty is not the same as truth, and that the willingness to hold a question open, sometimes for generations, is a kind of respect. Stromer respected the animal enough to measure every fragment before the fire took it. The teams in Morocco respect it enough to argue over every proportion. And the ones who came after, the ones who said the legs were scaled wrong, respect it enough to correct their own colleagues in print. None of this pretends to a resolution that the evidence has not earned. In a single vanished night in 1944, in what could only feel like a geological instant against the 96 million years the animal had already waited, the anchor was lost. What is remarkable is how much has been recovered since, from so little, by so many. The skeleton on the wall, then, is not the end of the inquiry. It is a snapshot of the argument at one moment, frozen for the visitors who walk beneath it. Change the scaling of a leg and you change the posture. Change the posture and you change the whole life you imagine for the creature, whether it swam or waded, dove or stood, ruled the deep channels or only patrolled their edges. These are not separate debates. They are one debate wearing different clothes, and it is far from over. The bones we have assembled, imperfect and contested and gathered from two countries, are enough to raise the question, but not, on their own, enough to close it. Settle deeper for a moment and let the scale of that patience wash over you. A creature so large it may have outweighed any land predator that ever lived, and we cannot yet agree on its weight to within a factor of 5. A body so distinctive it forced scientists to invent a new posture for it, and we cannot yet agree on whether that posture was ever real. This is the honest state of things, and there is a strange peace in hearing it said plainly, without the false confidence that so often gets painted over the gaps. You can rest inside an unfinished question. The animal has rested inside it for a very long time, so the pieces are back on the table at last, gathered from red Moroccan rock and old German drawings, corrected and recorrected, each proportion still argued over in the quiet, careful language of people who would rather be uncertain than wrong. The tall spines, the heavy bones, the short legs that may not be short at all. A giant reassembled from a torn photograph, its edges never quite matching, its true outline glimpsed through the seam. To rebuild a lost animal, you first have to look inside its bones without breaking them. That is where this work begins now, not with a chisel, but with faint beams of X-ray light. A modern medical scanner sends many thin beams through a fossil, one narrow plane at a time. Each beam records how much it dims as it crosses stone and empty space. Denser rock stops more of the beam, hollow cavities let it pass. The machine turns each pass into a single flat grey image, a slice. Then it takes another slice, a fraction of an inch deeper, and another. Hundreds of them, sometimes thousands. Stack those slices in order, like the pages of a book pressed edge to edge, and a solid appears on the screen. A virtual solid you can turn in your hands, cut open, and see straight through, while the real fossil never leaves the table. Picture your hand inside the pocket of a heavy winter coat, feeling the coins there through the cloth. You cannot see them. Your fingers never touch bare metal, yet you know the wide coin from the small one, the smooth edge from the milled edge, by pressure alone, by the shape pushing back through the fabric. A CT stack reads a fossil something like that. The scientists never saw the inside of the snout with their eyes. They felt it through the density of each slice, tracing the hollows through solid stone the way your fingers trace coins through a coat. When researchers ran this on a Spinosaurus snout across the years around 2005 to 2009, the front of the skull told a quiet story. The skull itself was long and narrow, roughly 5.5 feet from tip to back, its jaws lined with straight conical teeth that had no serrations, built to grip and not to slice. Near the tip, the bone was riddled with tiny openings, small canals the anatomists call foramina. On the surface they looked like scattered pinpricks. Inside, the slices showed those pinpricks joining, threading backward to a single shared cavity buried deep in the muzzle. Nothing was cut to reveal it. The stone stayed whole. They read the branching channels the way you might trace roots frozen inside clear ice, and they interpreted that network as a home for pressure receptors, the kind living crocodiles carry in their jaws, sensing a fish move in dark water long before the eye can find it. A single scanned bone is only a beginning. The larger task is gathering many of them, most found apart, some found in different countries, into one body. Here the fossil leaves the rock entirely and becomes numbers. Each scanned bone becomes a digital object, a dense cloud of measured points defining every ridge, every socket, every worn surface. On a screen you rotate it, scale it, set it gently beside its neighbour. Missing pieces are estimated from close relatives, from Bahariya in England, from Suchomimus in Niger, or mirrored across from the side that did survive. Slowly a virtual skeleton assembles itself, floating and whole. A thing that never once existed as a single set of real bones in any museum drawer. The tall spines rising from its back, some standing more than 5 feet above the vertebrae they grow from, curve up into empty digital air. A skeleton alone weighs nothing and floats nowhere, so the modelers clothe it. They drape estimated muscle and fat and skin over the digital frame, guided by where muscles anchor on living crocodiles and birds, and by the faint scars real muscles leave on real bone. Now the model has a body, an outline, a volume that can be measured exactly. From that volume and a chosen density for living tissue, a computer calculates mass. It also finds the balance point, the centre of mass, the single spot where the whole animal would hang level if you could lift it on one fingertip. That quiet point decides almost everything about how the creature stood and walked and whether it could float. And here a small choice grows a swarm. The 2014 reconstruction gave Spinosaurus short hind limbs and set its balance point well forward, near the middle of the torso, suggesting an animal that walked on all fours. Other researchers looked at the same limb bones and argued they had been scaled roughly 27% too short. 27% sounds minor. On a leg, it is not. Lengthen those hind limbs by that fraction, and you add weight and reach to the rear, and the balance point slides backward toward the hips. Suddenly the same skeleton stands like an ordinary two-legged hunter. One number, applied to a pair of bones, and the whole animal changes its posture. That is how tightly a digital reconstruction leans on its inputs, and why the estimates of this creature's weight still range from about 4 tons to nearly 21. one of the widest spreads of any famous dinosaur. Numbers on a screen can be argued over forever, so one team decided to build something they could push through real water. In 2018, they described a tail from the same Moroccan individual, about 80% complete, roughly 13 feet of it preserved. It was deep and flexible, framed by long spines above and long chevrons below, shaped less like a whip and more like a broad paddle or a fin. To test what such a tail could do, they made a scale model of it, a fabricated flexible copy, and mounted it on a small robotic rig. The machine swept the model from side to side in a tank of moving water, the way the living tail might have swung, while sensors measured the forward push it produced. This is a flow tank, and inside it a shape is no longer a guess. It either drives water or it does not. A single measurement means little without something honest to compare it against. So they built control tails printed in 3 dimensions from other animals and ran each one through the very same rig, same current, the same sweeping motion. One was the stiff, tapering tail of a land-living theropod, a dinosaur nobody believes swam. One was the tail of an alligator, a living animal that sculls easily through rivers. One was shaped from a whale, a true master of pushing water. Then they read the thrust from each in turn. The Spinosaurus tail produced roughly 8 times the forward push of the land dinosaur's tail. It performed nearly as well as the tails of living animals that swim by sweeping them. On that bench, in that water, the paddle looked built for the river. You might expect that to settle the whole matter. It did not, and the reason is worth resting with in the dark. These are careful methods, run by skilled and honest people, and yet different teams reach opposite ends. A model is only ever as sure as its assumptions, and every step here hides a choice. How much fat to drape and where, how dense to make the bones and the flesh, which limb length to trust, how much air to allow in the lungs, since air floats, and floating changes everything about how a body sits in water. A separate study even found the limb bones nearly solid and marrow-free, like a penguin's or a hippo's, which argues for sinking, while a spinosaurid cousin kept hollow, air-filled bones like a land animal. Alter any one of these defensibly, and the balance point drifts, the mass rises or falls, and the animal floats higher or lower. So one digital study in 2018 placed the balance point close to the hips, like other 2-legged dinosaurs, and calculated that such a body would tip and roll if it tried to float, unable to hold itself down to dive. A later effort in 2022 built its own full digital and physical models and reached the same unwelcome verdict. An animal too buoyant to sink, slow and unsteady in open water, better suited to standing at the edge than chasing prey through the deep. The tail team, reading their flow tank, saw a swimmer. The balance modelers, reading mass and buoyancy, saw a wader. The same fossil, the same tools, more or less. 2 opposite animals. None of these workers is careless. That is the hardest thing to hold, lying here in the quiet. Honest measurement does not always agree with itself. It narrows the field, it rules out the plainly impossible, and then it can still hand you a creature with 2 faces. The scanning had shown the sensing snout, threaded with its hidden canal. The digital skeleton had given the animal a shape and a weight, Within a wide and stubborn range, the flow tank had shown a tail that could truly drive water. Each tool had answered its own question well, and left the largest one standing open. Piece by piece, on the screen and on the bench, the animal had been made whole again. With the bones assembled again, the harder question returned, and it was about water. With the bones assembled again, the harder question returned, and it was about water. Not how big the animal was, or how it stood, but what it did with its day, where it fed, what it feared. And the strangest features of Spinosaurus, the ones that had puzzled everyone from the start, all seemed to point the same way, toward the slow brown channels of that Cretaceous delta. So walk out with the fossil for a while. Let the argument rest and look instead at the body itself, part by part, and ask what each piece was built to do. Begin at the back, because that is where the eye goes first. Rising from the vertebrae of the spine were bones unlike anything on a normal predator. Tall, thin blades of bone, called neural spines, standing up in a row along the animal's back. On the largest individuals, these spines exceeded 5.5 feet, taller than a grown person, growing straight out of the backbone, and they were slender for their height, more than 10 times as tall as the vertebrae beneath them were wide. Picture that ratio in your own hand. Take a coin between 2 fingers and imagine a flat blade standing up from its edge more than 10 times the coin's thickness. That is the proportion. A thin fan of bone, running much of the length of the back, held up on a foundation only a fraction as wide. In life, skin and tissue stretched between these spines, forming a great sail that rose and fell along the spine's curve, catching the low delta light. What the sail was for, no one can tell you with certainty. This is one of the honest gaps in the science, and it is worth sitting inside for a moment. Several ideas have been offered, and each has something going for it, and none has won. Some researchers proposed the sail was a radiator, a sheet of skin held out to shed or gather heat, warming the animal in the cool of morning and cooling it in the heat of the day. It is a tidy idea, but a heat-exchanging sail should carry the scars of blood vessels, grooves and canals in the bone, where warm blood once flowed close to the surface, and that clear vascular evidence has not been found, so other explanations crowd in. Perhaps the sail was for display, a banner of colour raised to attract a mate or to warn off a rival across the water, the way so many living animals turn their bodies into signals. Perhaps it was not a thin sail at all, but the bony core of a thick hump, a ridge of fat and muscle over the shoulders like the withers of a bison, a store of energy for lean seasons. Perhaps, when the animal swam, the sail worked as a keel, a hydrodynamic stabilizer breaking the surface like the fin of a sailfish, helping the body hold a straight line through the current. Each hypothesis fits some of the evidence. Each leaves something unexplained, and you can hold all of them at once gently without needing to choose, because the truth is that this part of the animal remains a riddle. Move forward now, along the neck, to the head. Here the strangeness sharpens into something you can almost feel. The skull was long and low and narrow, stretched out to somewhere between 5 and nearly 6 feet, shaped far more like the head of a crocodile than the head of a typical meat-eating dinosaur. Not a deep, box-like skull built to bite down through bone, a long, shallow trap built to snap shut on something slick and struggling. The teeth matched the shape. They were straight, round in cross-section, smooth cones, without the steak-knife serrations that most predatory dinosaurs carried along their teeth. 6 or 7 of these cones stood in each side of the upper front of the jaw, with about a dozen more running back along each upper jaw behind them. Serrated teeth are made to saw through flesh, to carve a mouthful loose. These smooth cones were made for a different job. They were made to grip, to hold, to keep a slippery, thrashing body from twisting free once the jaws had closed. And the bite that drove those teeth was not, for such a large animal, especially powerful. Estimates put the force at the front of the jaw at only around 1,000 pounds, rising to somewhat over 2,500 pounds toward the back. Those are respectable numbers, but modest for a predator this size, far below what a bone-crushing hunter would need. They are the numbers you would expect from an animal that seized moderate wriggling prey and held on, rather than one that crushed large victims to death. A trap, again, not a vice. Now the detail that turned many minds. In the middle of the last decade of research, scientists took the fossil snout and put it through a CT scanner, slicing it into thousands of digital cross-sections without ever cutting the bone. Inside the very tip of the snout, they found something remarkable. The bone was riddled with tiny openings, small canals called foramina, and these openings did not run off in scattered directions. They connected inward to a single shared cavity running through the front of the jaw, a neurovascular chamber, threaded with nerves and blood vessels, opening to the outside world through a scatter of pinholes right at the tip of the face. There is a living animal that carries almost exactly this structure, the crocodile. Along a crocodile's snout sit thousands of small dome-shaped pressure receptors, wired to a cavity like the one found in Spinosaurus, and they let the animal feel the water. A crocodile lying still in a dark river can sense the faint pressure wave of a fish moving nearby, the push of water displaced by a flicking tail, and it can strike at that disturbance without ever seeing its prey. The researchers who scanned the Spinosaurus snout interpreted its foramina and shared cavity the same way. A pressure-sensing face, a snout that could read the water. Hold that image against the delta scene. A Spinosaurus stands in warm, silt-brown shallows, the surface too clouded to see far into. Its snout rests just at or below the waterline, still, patient. Somewhere in front of it, unseen, a fish beats its tail and moves. The pressure of that movement travels through the water and reaches the pinholes at the tip of the snout, and the animal feels it, the way you might feel a breath of air on the back of your neck in a dark room. Then the long jaws snap sideways, the smooth cones close, and the grip hold, hunting by touch, in water too murky for eyes to matter. The nostrils fit the same picture. In most predatory dinosaurs, the nostrils sit near the front of the snout, well forward on the face. In Spinosaurus they had drawn back, retracted rearward, set higher and further along the skull. Pull your own breathing further up your face and imagine why. A snout that spends its hours with the tip lowered into water wants its airways kept clear of that water, set back where they can still draw breath while the front of the jaw works below the surface. Every feature here leans in the same direction, toward the waterline, toward a life spent with the face in the river. Now leave the head and go inward into the bones themselves, because this is where a quieter and in some ways stronger line of evidence lies. It is easy to be dazzled by a crocodile skull and a sensing snout. Bone density is harder to picture and harder to argue away. In a wide study of bone across roughly 250 to 300 living and extinct animals, researchers looked at how solid the limb bones were, how much of the interior was dense bone, and how much was hollow, air-filled space. The pattern they found is clean and worth understanding, because it maps onto how animals live. Land animals that walk and run tend to have hollow, lightened bones, cored out with air spaces, because on land you want your skeleton life and your energy spent moving, not carrying. But animals that forage underwater tend to run the opposite way. They pack their bones dense and solid, filling in the hollow spaces, because dense bone is heavy, and heaviness fights the buoyancy that would otherwise bob them back to the surface. Solid bone works as an internal ballast, a built-in weight belt that lets a swimmer sink and stay down. Penguins carry bones like this. So do hippos and manatees and the animals that make their living below the waterline. When the researchers placed the dinosaurs into that spread, Spinosaurus fell in with the divers. Its limb bones were nearly solid, dense, and marrow-free, sitting near the penguins and the hippos rather than near the hollow-boned runners of the land. Its English relative Bahariya sat in the same dense-boned company. Here was ballast written into the fabric of the skeleton, the kind of weighting you would want if your work was under the water rather than over it. And there is a beautiful complication in that same study, the kind that keeps science honest. Not every spinosaurid came out dense. Tromemus, a close cousin from what is now Niger, had ordinary hollow, air-filled bones, the bones of a land animal. So even within this one strange family, the underwater habit was not universal. Some members seem to have waded and grabbed at the edge, keeping their light land-going skeletons, while others, like Spinosaurus, packed on the ballast and went deep. The family was experimenting, and the experiment did not run the same way in every branch. Chemistry offered its own quiet witness from years earlier. Locked inside tooth enamel are oxygen isotopes, subtly different forms of oxygen whose ratios depend on the water an animal took in through its life. Animals that spend their days immersed, drinking and feeding and breathing in and round water, carry a different isotopic signature than animals that live dry on the land. When researchers measured the enamel of Spinosaurid teeth, the ratios did not sit with the other meat-eating dinosaurs. They sat closer to turtles and crocodilians, the isotope signature of animals bound to the water. Bone density and body chemistry, two entirely separate lines of evidence pointing the same way. If you are listening along and finding these fossils good company in the dark, follow or subscribe wherever you're listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice. Then let your attention drift back to the animal and to the last and strangest piece of it, the part that arrived most recently and argued the loudest, the tail. For decades, the tail of Spinosaurus was simply unknown, a blank at the back of every reconstruction, filled in by guesswork from other predators. Then, from the same Moroccan individual whose bones had rebuilt the animal, a tail came out of the ground, and it was extraordinary. Around 4/5 of it was there, roughly 13 feet of tail preserved, enough to see its whole shape at last, and its shape was like nothing on any other predatory dinosaur ever found. A normal theropod tail is a stiff, muscular rod held fairly straight and rigid, a counterbalance for the body over the hip built for walking and running, not for bending. This tail was the opposite of stiff. Its vertebrae carried tall, thin extensions above, elongated neural spines and matching thin bones hanging below, called chevrons, and together these blades made the tail deep from top to bottom, a broad, flexible fin of the thing, and it was mobile, jointed to sweep side to side rather than hold rigid. Not a rudder trailing behind the animal, a paddle, a great flexible oar of a tail, deep and flat and made to be moved. There is a way to test what a shape like that can do, and the researchers took it. They built a working model of the tail, a flexible foil driven back and forth by a machine in water, and they set it against models of other tails for comparison. A tail from an ordinary land-living theropod, a tail from an alligator, an animal that truly swims by sweeping its tail, even the fluke of a whale. They measured how much forward thrust each one produced when flapped through the water, and they let the numbers speak. The Spinosaurus tail produced roughly 8 times more thrust than the stiff tail of the land-going theropod. 8 times, and it performed nearly as well as the tails of living animals that swim for their living, closing much of the gap to the alligator, working like a real swimming organ rather than a landsman's afterthought. Whatever else was uncertain, the shape of this tail was not the shape of a tail, meant only to trail behind a walking animal. It was built to push water, and it pushed water well. So picture the motion, because this is where the tactile sense of the animal comes alive. Lower a flat hand into a bath of warm water, palm held vertical, and fan it slowly back and forth, feeling the water pile up against one side and then the other, feeling your hand pull forward against the resistance. That sculling, that patient side-to-side fanning, is what this tail could do at the scale of a river giant. A flat sweep gathering the water and driving the great body ahead, not the frantic churn of something fleeing. A slow, powerful oar, working the warm channel the way your hand works the bath. Take a slow, deep breath and hold the whole animal together in your mind for a moment, feature by feature, because assembled this way the case has a real force to it. A tall sail along the back, a long crocodile skull, its tip wired with pressure sensors to feel unseen fish. Smooth conical teeth built to grip, not to slice, driven by a modest holding bite. Nostrils drawn back off the waterline, bones packed dense as a diver's ballast, and body chemistry sitting with the turtles and crocodiles. And behind it all, a deep flexible paddle of a tail that pushes water 8 times better than any tail meant for the land. 6 separate features from 6 separate studies, and every one of them turned toward the river. And then, as if the anatomy were not enough, there is the food itself caught in the act. Fossils sometimes preserve not just a body, but a moment, and two such moments belong here. In one, a single Spinosaurus tooth was found embedded in the vertebra of a large fish, driven into the bone of the prey and left behind, a strike frozen in stone across 100 million years. In the other, from within the rib cage of a Spinosaurid, in the place where its stomach would have been, researchers recovered a fish scale etched and pitted by stomach acid, a scrap of a swallowed meal partly digested before the animal itself died. Not inference, not a model. The remains of an actual fish inside the predator and a tooth left in a fish that got away. The picture builds and builds, each piece settling onto the last. The world these animals lived in was made for it. A vast warm delta draining toward the ancient Tethys Sea, its channels braided and slow, thick with fish. Sawfish relatives longer than a car worked the shallows with their barbed snouts. Coelacanths, as long as a small boat, the giant Mawsonia, cruised the deeper water. There was food in that river to feed a giant many times over, and here was a giant shaped in every part to take it, a body assembled by evolution into something that read the water, sank into it, and swept through it after prey no other dinosaur was built to catch. Stand at the edge of that channel one more time in the failing light. The sail catches the last of the sun along its thin blades. The long snout lowers until its tip breaks the surface and vanishes into the murk. Somewhere ahead, unseen, a fish moves, and the pressure of it reaches the sinholes at the tip of that patient face. The dense body settles lower, ballasted, and the great paddle tail begins its slow, fanning sweep through the warm water, sculling the giant forward toward a meal it can feel but cannot see. Everything about the animal, from the bone to the chemistry to the very shape of its tail, seems to hold together into a single clear life, lived in and under the river. Set that swimming question aside for a moment, because there is a second riddle riding on the same animal, and it has nothing to do with whether Spinosaurus dove or waded. Look at its back. Rising from the vertebrae along the spine stood a row of tall, bony blades. The neural spines, the longest of them more than 5.5 feet high. That is taller than many grown people. Each blade climbed from a vertebra whose core was slender by comparison, so that the tallest spines rose more than 10 times the width of the bone they grew from. In life, skin or tissue almost certainly stretched between them, forming the great sail that gives the animal its name. And here is the strange part. After more than 100 years of study, no one can say for certain what that sail was for. There are 4 leading ideas, and it helps to walk through them slowly, one at a time, the way you might turn over 4 smooth stones in your hand. None of them is foolish, none is one. The first idea is heat. A tall, thin, blood-rich surface held up into moving air makes an efficient radiator. Stand it broadside to a breeze in the warm Cenomanian afternoon, and it could shed heat from an overheating body. Turn it flat toward a low morning sun, and it could soak warmth back in, letting the animal wake and move earlier than its rival. Living animals hint at this. Certain lizards angle their bodies to the sun to warm themselves. The elephant flares its ears, threaded with vessels, to dump heat into the air, so the thermoregulation idea has good company in the living world. The trouble is the evidence in the bone itself. A structure built mainly to move heat should carry the plumbing for it. Deep grooves and canals along the spines where large blood vessels once ran. In the Spinosaurus spines that have been examined, that strong vascular signature has not been clearly found. It is not proof against the idea. Soft tissue rots and leaves only faint mark, but the absence sits there, quietly, refusing to settle the case. The second idea is display. A sail does not need a purpose you can measure with a thermometer. It only needs to be seen. Picture the animal in profile against the bright water, and the sail becomes a billboard of the body, a way to look enormous from a distance without spending anything but posture. To a rival male, it might say, "Stay back." To a potential mate, it might say, "Here I am," healthy enough to grow this and carry it. Living animals lean on this trick constantly. Peacocks, sail-finned lizards, the crests and frills of countless species exist mostly to be noticed. Display is easy to imagine, and almost impossible to prove from bone alone, because being impressive leaves no fossil. That is its strength as a hypothesis, and also its weakness. It explains the sail beautifully and can be tested by almost nothing, so it survives, plausible and unconfirmed, in the same open drawer as the rest. The third idea changes the shape of the whole animal. In 1997, the paleontologist Jack Bailey looked at these tall-spined dinosaurs and asked whether we had been picturing them wrong. A thin sail, he argued, is not the only thing tall neural spines can support. Look at a modern bison. Over its shoulders rise long spines too, but no one imagines a sail there. Instead, they anchor a great muscular and fatty hump, the high withers that give the animal its silhouette. Bailey suggested that Spinosaurus and its kind might have been buffalo backs rather than sailbacks, the spines buried inside a thick ridge of fat and muscle. Instead of stretched thin as a membrane, a fatty hump would be a larder. In a river delta world where the fishing could turn lean between floods, stored energy along the back could carry the animal through hungry stretches the way a camel's hump does in a different desert. It is a genuinely different creature, the same skeleton wearing a different body. And the bones, so far, cannot fully decide between a thin taut sail and a thick loaded hump. The fourth idea takes the sail back into the water, though not in the way the swimming debate does. Some have proposed that the sail worked as a hydrodynamic aid, a stabilizer, something like the tall dorsal fin a sailfish raises. A deep fin along the midline can steady a body against roll and help it hold a straight line, or help it turn sharply without slewing sideways. If Spinosaurus spent long hours with its back at or near the surface, a sail breaking the waterline might have served as a keel above the body rather than below it, resisting the animal's tendency to tip. This idea is appealing because it ties the sail to a life spent partly in water, which fits so much else about the animal, but it runs into the same wall. A surface that catches wind or waves can just as easily be a hindrance as a help, and the physics cut both ways depending on exactly how the animal held itself. No one has shown, beyond argument, that the sail steadied Spinosaurus rather than shoving it around. Here is the honest shape of things. Researchers have tried to weigh these possibilities against each other rather than simply pick a favourite. The work of Gimser and colleagues published in the middle of the last decade, took the riddle of the dorsal sail seriously as a physics problem, turning over the thermal and hydrodynamic and display explanations and asking which the structure could actually have performed. That kind of careful weighing is what mature science looks like when the answer will not come easily. It does not hand you a verdict. It hands you a clearer sense of what each idea would require and where the bone falls silent. And the bone does fall silent, again and again. A blood vessel that has been gone for 97 million years does not testify. Fat leaves no skeleton. The colour and pattern that would have made a display sail worth displaying vanished with the skin. So each hypothesis survives not because it has been confirmed, but because it has not been ruled out. That is a different kind of survival, quieter, more patient. Thermoregulation lacks its expected vascular fingerprint, yet cannot be dismissed. Display fits the living world, yet leaves nothing to grip. The fatty hump reshapes the animal, yet cannot be separated cleanly from the thin sail picture. The stabilizer ties everything together, yet may hinder as much as it helps. 4 stones in your hand, and every one of them heavy in its own way. It is worth noticing how this riddle sits apart from the louder fight over how Spinosaurus lived. Whether the animal dove after fish or stood in the shallows and grabbed them, the sail could still have been for heat, or for show, or for storing fat, or for balance. A wading heron of a dinosaur could carry a display sail just as easily as a diving one. A swimming Spinosaurus could carry a fatty hump just as easily as a shoreline one. The two questions barely touch. You could imagine settling the swimming debate completely and still knowing nothing new about why the back rose so high. So the sail keeps its own counsel, off in its own corner, unbothered by the argument next door. There is a way to hold this that makes the uncertainty feel less like failure. Think of a single page printed in 2 languages, the same lines running side by side, each fluent, each complete, neither one wrong on its face. A reader who knows only the first language reads it and finds it whole. A reader who knows only the second reads the very same page and also finds it whole. The bones of the sail are that page. Read them in the language of heat, and they make sense. Read them in the language of display or fat or balance, and they make sense there too. The page is not lying in any of those tongues. It is simply written in more than one, and we have not yet learned which the animal itself was speaking. Perhaps it was speaking several at once. Living structures rarely do only one job. Ears cool and hear, tails balance and signal and swat flies. A sail that began as a display feature could have shed heat as a bonus, or a hump built to store fat could have doubled as a billboard of health. The fatter the ridge, the fitter the animal wearing it. The clean 4-way menu we lay out for tidiness may not be how biology actually cooked. The real answer could be a blend, weighted one way in one season and another way in another. And a blend is exactly the kind of answer that fossils are worst at preserving. So the tall spines stay a genuine open question, presented here as a menu and not a verdict, because a verdict would be dishonest. You are allowed to sit with that. You do not have to choose tonight. The sail rose more than 5 feet into the warm delta air. It caught the low light along the animal's back, and it meant something to the creature that carried it through 100-degree afternoon by the water. What that something was, we hold loosely. 4 possibilities open on the table, none crossed out. And that same patient uncertainty runs deeper still, all the way down into the argument over the animal's whole way of life. It is a powerful picture, a diving river giant, and yet not everyone who studied the same bones came away believing it. It is a powerful picture, a diving river giant, and yet not everyone who studied the same bones came away believing it. Science works this way quietly, in the small hours between confident papers. One team assembles a picture, and another team assembles a different one, and both are pointing at the same scattered fossils. Nothing about the bones has changed, only the reading of them, and in the case of Spinosaurus the reading has swung back and forth for years, gentle as a tide, patient as sediment settling in still water. So let the current pull you the other way now, away from the swimming otter lizard of the last picture, toward the doubters, not to prove them right, only to sit with them a while in the lamplight of their careful arithmetic and understand why the same paddle tail, the same dense bones, the same crocodile snout could add up in their hands to a very different animal. The first serious challenge came not from a shovel in the field, but from a computer. In 2018, a Canadian paleontologist named Donald Henderson built Spinosaurus again, this time inside a machine. He was a specialist in exactly this kind of question, the mathematics of how bodies float and balance and fall over. He took the published skeleton and rebuilt it as a 3-dimensional digital model, an animal made of measured volumes rather than plaster and steel. Then he asked the model simple physical questions. Where does its weight sit? Will it tip? Will it sink? The answers did not match the swimming story. When Henderson calculated the centre of mass, the single point where all the animal's weight seems to gather, it landed close to the hip, not out in the middle of the torso where a low, 4-legged water-going creature would carry it, close to the hips, the way it sits in ordinary bipedal theropods, the 2-legged meat-eaters that walked on land. In other words, by this measure, Spinosaurus balanced its weight the way its dry-footed cousins did, over the 2 great pillars of its back legs. That single point matters more than it sounds. Think of where the weight sits as the whole secret of how a body behaves. Picture balancing a broom upright on your open palm. All that length above you stays manageable only because you keep shifting your hand under the point where the broom's weight concentrates. Let that point drift. Let it climb too high or slide too far forward, and the broom topples no matter how quick your hand. A living body is the same problem, solved by muscle and instinct instead of a palm. Move the centre of mass to the wrong place, and every step, every turn, every drift in current becomes a fight against falling. Henderson pushed the model into water and asked the next question. Would it float upright, the way a swimming animal needs to, keeping its head clear and its back level? His numbers said no. The digital Spinosaurus was unstable at the surface, prone to rolling, prone to tipping onto its side like an overloaded canoe. It wanted to capsize. The tall sail on its back, so striking on land, became a liability in water. a great flat vein that caught the current and helped push the body over rather than hold it steady. And there was a deeper problem still: buoyancy. Henderson found the animal too buoyant to dive, too full of lightness to force itself under. However it pushed, the water pushed back harder, lifting it toward the surface it was trying to leave. And here is the second image to keep: softer than the broom, easier to sink into as you lie there. Think of holding a cork under the surface of a still bath. You press it down with one finger, and the moment your attention wanders, it slips free and bobs back up. Streaming water, stubborn, impossible to keep beneath. Henderson's model said Spinosaurus behaved like that cork. A body you could not hold under no matter how you pressed. A predator built, on paper, to float rather than to hunt in the deep. Now sit with the strangeness of that. The same bones that argued for a diver argued here for something that could barely stay submerged. The dense skeleton, the one offered as ballast for sinking, was not enough in Henderson's math to overcome the great buoyant volume of the body and that high, wide sail. Weight in the bones, yes, but lift everywhere else, and the sum came out floating. You might expect a single study to settle little, and you would be right. Henderson's work was a challenge, not a verdict. It said, at minimum, that the swimming picture had physics to answer. It set a question mark hovering over the diving river giant, and that question mark did not go away. It grew. 4 years later, in 2022, it grew into one of the largest counter-arguments the debate has seen. A team led by Paul Sereno, one of the paleontologists who had helped describe the animal in the first place, published a long, deliberate rebuttal in the journal Eli. Its title left no room for gentleness. It said, plainly, that Spinosaurus is not an aquatic dinosaur, and behind that flat sentence sat years of work. Sereno's team did not rely on a single model. They built the animal twice over. Once as a full digital reconstruction, a complete three-dimensional body assembled from the known bones and the proportions of its relatives, and once, remarkably, as a physical model, a scaled thing you could actually put in water and watch. They wanted to test the swimming hypothesis not only in equations but in the honest resistance of a real fluid where a body either holds its line or wallows and rolls. Their conclusions echoed Henderson and went further. In their models, Spinosaurus was unstable in water, tending to roll onto its side rather than knife forward. It was slow, a poor and inefficient swimmer compared to the living animals that truly chase prey beneath the surface, and once again it was too buoyant to submerge, unable to bring its whole body under and keep it there. The great tail that had produced so much thrust in the flapping foil experiments could, in their reading, drive an animal that could not hold a stable course, power without steering, a paddle on a boat that keeps trying to capsize. So what did they think it did instead? Here the rebuttal offered its own animal, and it is worth picturing slowly. They proposed a semi-aquatic bipedal ambush piscivore. Unfold that phrase and it becomes a scene you can stand inside. Semi-aquatic, at home in and around the water, not truly of it. Bipedal, standing and moving on its two back legs, the ordinary theropod posture, not the low four-legged crawler of the 2014 picture. Ambush, patient, waiting, striking rather than pursuing. Piscivore, a fish-eater still, its whole snout and its conical teeth pointed at slippery prey. Put those together and you get a hunter of the shoreline, an animal that waded into the shallows on long legs and stood, still as a heron, at the water's edge, head lowered, snout tip resting it or just below the surface, waiting for the flicker of a fish within reach, then striking down and forward to seize it, the way a wading bird stabs into a stream. Not a diver at all in this picture, a stander, a watcher, a giant fishing pole of an animal, rooted in the mud where river meets air, taking what came within a body length of its jaws. It is in its way no less vivid than the swimming giant, only quieter. Instead of a dark shape rolling through deep channels, you get a still silhouette against the shallows, this sail catching low light along its back, the long legs disappearing into brown water, the whole animal holding a patience that a diver would never need. Both animals are Cretaceous. Both are enormous. Both eat fish from the same warm river. They simply meet the water at a different depth. And this is the heart of what these rebuttals ask you to accept. Not that the swimming story is foolish, but that it is not proven, that the same fossils, honestly measured, can be assembled into a wader as easily as a diver. The bones do not speak. We speak for them, and reasonable people looking at the identical evidence have come to opposite conclusions and defended both with real mathematics. That is not failure. That is the ordinary slow machinery of a science correcting and rechecking itself out loud in public over years. Consider how the very evidence that seemed most decisive can cut in more than one direction. The dense bones, for instance. The near-solid, marrow-poor limb bones that looked like such clean proof of an underwater forager, bones like a penguin's or a hippo's, made for sinking and working below the surface. That signal is real, and it is striking. But look one branch over on the tree and the signal blurs. Spinosaurus had in close relatives other members of the long-snouted, fish-eating Spinosaurid clan. One of them, Suchomimus, lived earlier, in what is now Niger, roughly 112 million years ago, a slender giant some 30 to 36 feet long. And when researchers measured the bone density of Suchomimus in that same 2022 survey, they found the opposite of Spinosaurus: hollow bones, air-filled bones, the light pneumatic skeleton of a typical land dinosaur, the kind built for walking, not for sinking. Sit with what that means. Within a single family of closely related fish-eaters, one member carried the dense bones of a diver, and another carried the airy bones of a strider. Diving, if that is even what the dense bones mean, was not universal, not a fixed inheritance passed to every branch. It was something that could appear in one lineage and be absent in its cousin. So the dense bones of Spinosaurus tell you that this particular animal was doing something in the water that Suchomimus was not. They do not tell you on their own exactly what. The counterpoint cuts both ways. It weakens the neat idea that the whole family marched together into the water, and it leaves the question of Spinosaurus itself, diver or wader, still genuinely open. The teeth and the jaws seem, at first, as if they should decide it. Surely the way an animal bites reveals how it hunts, and so researchers estimated the bite force of Spinosaurus, the raw squeezing power those long jaws could bring to bear. The numbers came back modest for such a giant. something on the order of 4,829 newtons at the front of the jaw, near the snout tip, and around 11,936 newtons farther back toward the throat, where the leverage runs higher. For an animal of this size, those are not crushing figures. They are not the bone-splintering vice of a tyrannosaur. But that softness fits the fish-eater perfect. You do not need to shatter bone to hunt fish. You need to grip, to hold something muscular and slick and thrashing long enough to keep it, and the straight, conical, unserrated teeth and the modest gripping bite are exactly the tools for that. A cage of smooth teeth closing on a slippery body, holding rather than cutting. The whole jaw reads as a trap for prey that wants to slide free, and yet, notice what those bite numbers do not tell you. They confirm a fish eater. They do nothing to separate a swimmer from a wader. A diving Spinosaurus seizing fish underwater and a wading Spinosaurus stabbing fish from the shallows would use the same gentle, gripping bite in exactly the same way. The teeth are evidence of diet, not of depth. So this clue too, which felt as if it might break the tie, simply passes the question along untouched. Diet, settled. Method, open. That is the pattern you keep meeting in this debate, and it is worth naming plainly in the calm of the late hour. Almost every single line of evidence is compatible with more than one animal. The snout with its pressure sensing pits works for a diver feeling fish in murky water, and for a wader feeling fish in the shallows at its feet. The tall sail could stabilize a swimmer, or signal to a mate, or store fat, or shed heat, on land or in water alike, and no one has proven which. The paddle tail makes thrust, but thrust serves a body crossing a channel just as it serves a body chasing prey through it. The dense bones say water, but not how deep. The bite says fish, but not from where. The same bones support both stories. That sentence is not a shrug. It is the honest centre of the matter. Two careful teams working from the identical scattered skeleton. One rebuilt largely from Moroccan fossils after the original Egyptian bones were lost to a bomb in 1944, have built a diver and a wader and defended each with models and measurements. Neither has produced the single fact that ends the argument, and that is where the science genuinely stands. Not with the aquatic dinosaur confirmed, not with it refuted, with the question open, held between the two pictures, waiting for the next fossil or the next model to lean it one way. You will hear this animal described confidently as the first swimming dinosaur, the great diving predator of the Cretaceous, and that picture may well be true, but it is not settled, and honesty asks you to hold it lightly. The competing picture, the patient wader standing in the shallows, is not a fringe idea. It comes from some of the same scientists who first reshaped the animal, armed with digital and physical models and the plain physics of balance and buoyancy. When you're told which one Spinosaurus was, the truthful answer for now is that we do not yet know. The bones have not finished speaking, and we have not finished learning how to listen. There is something restful in that uncertainty, if you let there be. We so often want the closed door, the final answer, the animal pinned and labelled. But deep time rarely hands us that. It hands us fragments and a chance to reason carefully, and the discipline to say out loud that two answers remain standing. The diver and the wader both live on for now, in the same river of the mind, and that is not a flaw in the knowledge. It is the knowledge being honest about its own edges. Hold the two images together one last time, gently, the way you might hold two possibilities as you drift towards sleep. On one hand, the broom balanced upright on your open palm, all that weight riding high and eager to topple, the animal that Henderson's math said could not hold itself steady in open water. On the other, the cork you press beneath the bath and cannot keep down, bobbing back to the surface, the buoyant body that would not stay submerged. Those two small tactile truths are the whole rebuttal, made simple enough to feel in your own hands. A body too tippy to swim well, and too light to sink and stay. From those two feelings the wading giant was born, and whichever giant it was, remember that neither of them stood in that world alone. The debate over swimming and wading can make it feel as though the argument is only about one animal and its physics, one skeleton turning inside a computer. But the river itself was crowded, loud, and dangerous, thick with other lives on the same warm floodplain. In the long reach of deep time, this whole fierce disagreement is a single quiet moment, a geological instant of human argument laid over 100 million years of vanished water and vanished flesh. The mud that holds the answer holds a great deal else besides. Giant sawfish, giant coelacanths, rival predators as large as the contested giant himself. So let the question rest where it truly rests, open and unhurried, and let your attention drift outward from the single sail-backed hunter to the water all around it. Because the last thing this animal wants to teach you is that it was never the only monster in the story. The water here does not end so much as thin out. Toward the north, the channels you have been following widen and slow, and the land loses its nerve, giving way by inches to the ancient Tethys Sea. This is a delta, one of the largest the Cretaceous world will ever build, and you are standing somewhere in the middle of it, about 97 million years back, in the warm heart of the Cenomanian. The ground beneath your feet is silt, soft and dark and freshly laid. The air is heavy with water it has not yet decided to release. Look outward, and the river is not one river. It is many. Braided channels split and rejoin across the flats, the colour of weak tea, carrying suspended mud down from a continent's worth of eroding highland. Between them rise low green thickets, plants that lean toward the light the way mangroves will one day lean, their roots braced in brackish ooze. Farther out, the fresh water begins to trade places with the sea. Tidal flats gleam at low water. Shallow lagoons hold their own quiet, salt enough to sting, warm enough to feel like breath. The whole plain drains, slowly and forever, toward that shining northern edge where the land finally gives up. Now you understand where the giant lived. Not in a river exactly, in a sea, in the wet, uncertain place where continent becomes ocean, and neither one fully wins. The sound reaches you before you have finished looking. Overhead, pterosaurs turn on the rising warm air, wings held stiff, calling to one another in thin, dry voices that carry a long way over open water. Some of them are enormous, their wingspans wider than the reach of any bird that will ever fly. They wheel and tilt and hang, reading the currents of the sky the way the fish below read the currents of the flood. Their shadows slide across the shallows and are gone. You could lie back and watch them for an hour and never see one land. The light off the water is the next thing you notice, and it is relentless. Sun glare scatters across the wide silt-brown surface in a million broken pieces, so bright at midday that the far bank dissolves into it. The Cenomanian sun sits high and close. The delta throws its heat straight back up. Everything shimmers a little at the edges, and the world past a certain distance stops being solid and becomes a suggestion of itself. Just under that glare, the water is busy. A long dark shape works the shallows with a slow, sweeping patience, and as it passes you see the reason for its shape. This is Onchopristis, a sawfish relative built along ancient lines, its snout drawn out into a flat blade lined on both sides with barbed teeth that jut sideways like a row of hooks. It reaches perhaps 28 feet, longer than the delta looks like it should be able to hide. It swings that toothed blade through a school of smaller fish, slashing and sensing, feeling the panicked water against its snout. Its shed teeth will one day be among the most common fossils in these beds, scattered by the thousand through the stone, a whole vanished animal reduced to a drift of barbed points. Deeper, where the channels cut down into cooler dark, other giants cruise. Mawsonia moves there, a coelacanth of a lineage already ancient in this ancient world. Some of these fish run past 17 feet, among the largest bony fish that will ever swim in fresh or brackish water. They are heavy, unhurried, lobe-finned, holding in the current with small deliberate movements. You would not see one from the bank. You would only feel, somehow, that the deep channel was occupied, and it is. Beneath the surface glare, this delta is stacked with life, layer on layer, sharks of the open sea nosing up the salt channels, crocodile-shaped hunters of many sizes lying like waterlogged wood along the margins, turtles resting on the flats. Turn now toward the land, and the character of the world changes. Away from the water, the ground dries and hardens and lifts into flood plain, and the heat here becomes a visible thing. Out over that far dry ground, the air wavers and climbs, the way it wavers above a wide stretch of stone baked all day by an unbroken sun, so that the tree line in the distance seems to float, unmoored, trembling just above the earth that holds it. Through that trembling curtain, shapes move. They are theropods, and some of them are giants in their own right. Along the margin between the wet and the dry walk Carcharodontosaurus, a hunter built for the land the way Spinosaurus is built for the sea. It runs perhaps 40 feet or more from snout to tail, carrying a skull close to 5 feet long, its jaws set with blades rather than the fishing pegs of the river giant. This is a different kind of predator, made for dry ground and large prey, and it moves with the confidence of an animal that fears very little. In the shimmer it looks larger than it is, then smaller, then larger, as the hot air bends the light around it. It does not hunt alone up there. Smaller theropods thread the tree line with it. There is Deltadromeus, lighter and faster, built to run down what the big hunters cannot catch. There are abelisaurs, short-faced and blunt. One of them a creature named Rugops, its skull barely a foot long, its snout carrying a curious row of large openings where blood vessels and nerves once ran. Openings that may have fed some structure of display, some patch of specialized skin that no one now can see. Each of these animals keeps to its own scale and its own share, and together they crowd the dry margin the way the fish crowd the water. And this is the thing that will trouble the people who study this place, long after all of it has turned to stone. Take a moment with it, because it is genuinely strange. Here in one delta, at one time, you have not one giant meat-eater, but several. Spinosaurus at the water, Carcharodontosaurus on the floodplain, Deltadromeus running between them, Belosaur or two, and beneath the surface the sawfish and the sharks and the great coelacanth, each of them a predator, each of them hungry, each of them somehow fed. Modern landscapes rarely support more than one or two top hunters over a given stretch of ground, because there is only so much prey to go around. This delta seems to have carried a whole crowd of them at once. No one has fully explained how. The most likely answer is the water itself. A delta this size, fed by a continent and flushed by the tides, is a machine for making food. Fish spawn in numbers that beg accounting. The channels refill with each flood. The sea pushes life up the salt margins, and the rivers push life down. Perhaps the giants divided the feast so finely that they rarely met, one taking fish from the shallows, another taking flesh from the floodplain, a third taking whatever the first two missed. Perhaps the sheer productivity of the place papered over a math that should not have worked. The honest answer is that paleontologists still find this density hard to account for, and they say so plainly. A food web that rich is not something the modern world offers up for comparison. If you're drifting now, let the numbers go and keep only the feeling of the place. Follow or subscribe wherever you are listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice, and let the delta stay with you a little longer. There is no hurry here. There never was. This world moved at the pace of water finding the sea, so settle into it. Feel the warm mud give slightly under your weight. Smell the green rot of the mangrove thickets, the salt tang riding in on the tide, the faint metal of all that suspended silt. Hear the pterosaurs still calling somewhere above the glare, and under them the small constant noises of a living shore, the plop of a fish, the slide of something heavy entering the water, the hiss of wind through the leaning plant. The light is gold and merciless on the channels. The heat lies over the far ground like a slow curtain that never quite stops moving. Somewhere out there a sawfish sweeps its blade through a silver crowd, and somewhere in the deep channel a coelacanth holds its place against the current, and along the trembling tree line a land giant walks with its head lifted, tasting the air. This is the neighbourhood. Not a single creature in a single frame, a crowded, humid, sun-struck world, thick with hunters at every scale and depth, all of them drawing their living from the same enormous flood. The sail-backed giant you have been following belongs to all of it. It wades the seam between the water and the land, and on both sides of that seam it is surrounded. Above it, the wheeling pterosaurs. Beneath it, the sawfish and the sharks and the great slow coelacanths. Behind it, across the shimmer of the floodplain, the rival giants of the dry ground. This was never an empty stage with one animal on it. It was a full and jostling place, generous and dangerous in equal measure, and every meal it offered was a meal something else also wanted. Whatever it truly did at the water's edge, Spinosaurus never hunted that river alone. Whatever it truly did at the water's edge, Spinosaurus never hunted that river alone. Whatever it truly did at the water's edge, Spinosaurus never hunted that river alone. Picture the floodplain again, wide and low under a humid sky, roughly 97 million years back. The channels braid across the silt flats, brown and slow, draining north toward the shallow Tethys Sea. Along their banks, in the water and above it, moves a cast of giants so crowded that paleontologists still puzzle over how one landscape could feed them all. This was not a quiet river with a single master. It was one of the most predator-heavy places the fossil record has ever handed us. Walk with the sail-backed giant away from the water for a moment, out toward the drier ground where heat shimmers over the floodplain. There, along the tree line, moves a different kind of hunter. Not a fisher. A killer of large land animals, built low and heavy and fast with a skull like a hatchet. This is Carcharodontosaurus saharicus, and its name tells you plainly what it was. It means shark-toothed lizard, given for teeth that were flattened side to side, edged with fine serrations, curved back like a row of blades. Where Spinosaurus gripped slippery fish with straight, smooth cones, this animal sliced. Carcharodontosaurus was among the largest meat-eating dinosaurs that ever lived, a true rival to the river giant in bulk if not in length. Its body ran somewhere between about 39 and 45 feet from nose to tail. Its weight is estimated near 13,000 to 17,000 pounds. The mass of a large bull elephant and then some carried on 2 pillar legs. The head alone was a marvel of scale. The best skull we have measures somewhere between about 4 3/4 and 5 1/4 feet long. Set that against your own body. A skull taller than most grown people stand, hinged with muscle, lined with those slicing teeth. And here the two giants share more than a river. They share a wound in the history of science. Because the first bones of Carcharodontosaurus, like the first and only skeleton of Spinosaurus, were described by Ernst Stromer, named by him in the year 1931, and like the Spinosaurus material, that original Carcharodontosaurus material was kept in Munich in the Bavarian collection. And on the same night of fire in April of 1944, the same bombing raid that erased the world's only Spinosaurus skeleton took the shark-toothed lizard with it. Two giants of the same lost river, catalogued by the same careful hand, turned to ash in the same hour. What was found in one desert had been carried across a sea and a continent only to be undone in a single night. For decades after, Carcharodontosaurus was, like its neighbour, a ghost of drawings and notes. Then came the same slow correction. In 1995, the paleontologist Paul Sereno, working the Chem beds of Morocco, recovered a magnificent skull. It became the new anchor specimen, the neotype, the physical stand-in for everything the bomb had taken. From that skull, and the scattered bones around it, the animal was rebuilt a second time, the way Spinosaurus would be rebuilt from Moroccan stone a generation later. Two lost giants, both pulled back into the light from the same rock, both reassembled out of destruction. The desert gave back what the fire had taken in fragments to anyone patient enough to dig. So already you have two apex predators standing in one landscape, and the strangeness does not stop there. The Kem and Bahariya rocks preserve at least 4 large-bodied meat-eaters in the same food web. Beyond the fish-hunting sailback and the shark-toothed slicer, there was Deltadromeus agilis, a lighter, longer-legged theropod built for speed, its very name meaning delta runner, for the river delta ground it crossed, and there was at least one more, an abellisaurid still unnamed, known from bones that do not yet match any species we have described, a giant hiding in plain sight in the collections. Smaller hunters filled the gaps between the giants. Among the abellisaurids of this broader African world was Rugops primus, a modest-headed predator whose skull ran only about a foot long, roughly a third the length of a Carcharodontosaurus head. Along its snout ran a row of large openings, channels for blood vessels and nerves, a feature some researchers link to skin structures used for display, perhaps colour, perhaps a crest of soft tissue we will never directly see. Rugops was no killer of the great herbivores. It was likelier a scavenger and a taker of small prey, one more mouth in a crowded room, keeping to the edges where the big ones did not bother to look. Above all of them, the air itself carried giants. Pterosaurs wheeled over the water on leathery wings, some of them enormous, their calls threading through the humid heat as they scanned the channels for fish left stranded on the flats. And in the water swam predators that never touched land at all. Lamniform sharks, relatives of the lineage that would one day produce the great whites, cut through the brackish reaches near the coast. The river was not a single ribbon of danger, it was danger stacked in layers, in the air, on the banks, at the surface, and down in the deep channels where the light went brown and then black. To feel how strange this abundance is, hold one image in your mind. Imagine a single long table, crowded far past comfort, with far too many diners crammed elbow to elbow, every one of them reaching for the same few plates in the middle. That is what this river was to a paleontologist's eye. Modern ecosystems tend to support 1 or 2 top predators of a given size, because each giant needs an enormous supply of prey to survive. Here there were 3 or 4 crowded together, plus the fishers, plus the flyers, plus the sharks. Something about this river fed them all, and working out exactly how remains an open question. Part of the answer lay beneath the surface, in the sheer richness of the water. And here we come to the creatures that gave Spinosaurus its living, the fish that were large enough to be worth a giant's attention. First among them, and among the most common fossils in the whole Chem system, was Onchopristis numidus. If you saw its silhouette gliding just under the silt-brown surface, you might mistake it for a sawfish, and you would be close, but not right. It was a sclerorhynchoid, a cartilaginous fish, a cousin of sharks and rays rather than a true modern sawfish. But it wore the same terrible tool at the front of its body. From its snout projected a long, flattened blade, its edges set with rows of barbed teeth that pointed outward to the side, each one hooked like a fishhook turned the wrong way. Onchopristis swept this saw sideways through schools of smaller fish, slashing and pinning, its whole face a sensing, striking weapon. And it grew huge. The largest individuals reached an estimated 28 feet in length, longer than the Spinosaurus that hunted them, a fish the size of a small whale working the shallows of a warm river. To take one of these was no small meal and no small effort, even for the sail-backed giant with its pressure-sensing snout. The barbed teeth of that saw are worth pausing on, because they are everywhere in the rock. Onchopristis shed and replaced its rostral teeth throughout its life, the way sharks shed theirs, and it did so in such numbers, across so many animals, over so many thousands of years, that the fossils now lie scattered through the chem beds in staggering abundance. Walk the right slope of that Moroccan stone today, and the shed sawfish teeth lie underfoot, the way fallen leaves lie after a storm, so common you could not count them, each one a small barbed spike of a vanished mouth. When a single kind of tooth becomes the gravel of a hillside, you begin to grasp how thick with life that water once was. And there were fish, stranger and in their way, more astonishing than the giant saw-bearer. In the deeper channels cruised the coelacanths of the genus Mawsonia, and these were not the modest fish that name might suggest. Coelacanths are famous today as living fossils, deep-sea survivors thought extinct until one was hauled up alive in the 20th century. But in this Cretaceous river swam their giant Mesozoic relatives, and giant is the only word that fits. Typical large Mawsonia reached about 11 to 13 feet, and the largest individuals we can infer, scaled up from a single massive jawbone, may have approached 17 feet, placing them among the very largest bony fish that have ever lived, in any age of the world. Sit with that for a moment. A coelacanth as long as a Nile crocodile, a heavy-scaled, slow-cruising giant of the deep channels, sharing the water with a 28-foot sawfish and a diving, sail-backed dinosaur. These were not minnows for a giant to snap up in passing. They were substantial animals, some of them rivals in size to the predators that may have hunted them. The line between hunter and hunted blurs in a river like this. A young Spinosaurus was prey to the crocodiliforms and the sharks. A large Mawsonia was more than a mouthful even for the sailback. Everything here lived pressed against everything else, which returns us to the puzzle of the crowded table. How does one river, however rich, support Spinosaurus, Carcharodontosaurus, Altadromius, an unnamed abelisaurid, giant pterosaurs, giant crocodiliforms, and open water sharks, all at once, all large, all hungry? The leading answer is that they were not, in truth, all reaching for the same plate. The river split its bounty. Spinosaurus, with its conical teeth and its pressure-sensing snout, and its heavy, nearly solid bones, took the fish, the Onchopristis, and the Mawsonia, and the smaller schooling species of the channel, Dontosaurus, with its slicing blades, took the land animals, the great long-necked plant-eaters of the drier ground. Altadromius ran down smaller, faster prey. The division of the table let the diners share it. This idea that predators avoid direct competition by carving up the food supply into separate niches is called resource partitioning, and it is one of the ways ecologists explain crowded ancient faunas. Yet even with partitioning, the density here strains the models. It may be that the fossil record is compressing time, mixing animals that lived thousands of years apart into a single rock layer, so that the river only appears to hold them all at once. It may be that the river was simply that productive, fed by monsoon floods and a warm sea, growing fish faster than the giants could eat them. The honest answer is that we do not fully know. This is a place where the science is still reaching for its footing, and it is worth saying so plainly. Now step back from the water itself, and widen the frame all the way out, past the individual bones to the deep time journey that carried them to you. Because the real subject of this river is not any one giant. It is what the whole tangled record shows about how knowledge is made and lost and made again. Consider the full arc. A floodplain lives and dies, animals sink into the mud of its channels, and the mud hardens, and over unimaginable spans the bones turn to stone, the sea comes and goes, the land rises, deserts scour the surface until the fossils lie exposed on the slopes, waiting. That is the ordinary miracle of every fossil, the slow passage from living flesh to patient rock. But this river's bones took a stranger road than most. They were found once in the deserts of Egypt and carried across the world to a museum in Germany and studied and drawn and named. And then, in a single night of war, the only skeleton was destroyed, and the shark-toothed giant beside it as well, and for 60 years the world's longest predatory dinosaur existed only as ink on paper. Then, decades later, new bones surfaced in Morocco in different rock, in a different country, and the animal was assembled a second time from fresh fragments, buried, fossilized, rediscovered, lost to a bomb, and painstakingly rebuilt. Few creatures have ever been dug out of oblivion twice, and even the second assembly is not settled. Some researchers argue that the Moroccan bones used to redefine Spinosaurus may not all belong to the same animal as Stromer's lost Egyptian original, that a separate name, Sigilmassasaurus, might apply to part of the material. The modern picture of the river giant is a composite stitched from bones found on 2 continents, in 2 formations by 2 generations of scientists, with real and unresolved doubt about whether every piece belongs. This is not a flaw to be embarrassed about. This is what an honest reconstruction looks like when the original evidence has been burned. That, in the end, is the deepest thing this contested giant reveals. Not its size, which we cannot pin down, the estimates ranging across many feet and many tons. Not its lifestyle, still argued in papers over whether it swam and dove or waded and waited. What it reveals is the shape of science itself, the way understanding is never a finished statue but a thing under constant revision. Every figure here carries an error bar. Every reconstruction is the best guess pending better bones. The 1944 fire did not end the inquiry. It only forced the work to begin again, more carefully, from new stone in the Moroccan sun. You might expect that to feel like failure, a science that keeps correcting itself, that cannot give you one clean number for how long the animal was. It is the opposite, the willingness to say we were wrong, to rescale a limb, to reassign a bone, to hold 2 competing ideas open at once because the evidence genuinely supports both. That is the machinery working exactly as it should. A field that never revised itself would be a field that had stopped looking. The story of Spinosaurus is the story of that revision, drawn out across a full century, and it is not finished tonight, and it does not need to be. So let the whole river settle back into your mind, complete, for one last look before the light goes. The braided channels under the humid air, the sail catching the low sun along one grey flank at the water's edge, the barbed saw of an Onchopristis carving through a school of fish just below the surface, the dark, heavy shape of a 17-foot coelacanth cruising the deep channel where the brown water turns to black, the shark-toothed giant moving along the distant tree line through the shimmer of heat, and the pterosaurs wheeling and calling overhead, and the smaller runners threading between them all. A single crowded table, every seat filled, the plates passing hand to hand. Now let the years begin to move. The floodplain floods and dries across spans your mind cannot hold. The Tethys Sea creeps in and covers everything in quiet grey mud, and the mud presses down, and the bones within it harden toward stone. In a mere geological instant measured against the age of the earth, the whole living river is sealed away underground. The giants that shared that water do not vanish all at once. They fade away one by one into the sediment, sail and saw and slicing tooth alike, each settling into the dark where the pressure and the mineral water will, over 90 million years and more, remember their shapes long after the flesh is gone. The sun over that river sets for the last time it will ever fall on a living Spinosaurus. The pterosaurs come down to roost, the water goes still and cools, and the calls of insects and small amphibians rise from the banks in the humid dark, the same soft chorus that will outlast every giant here by tens of millions of years. Nothing on that floodplain knows it is ending. It simply lives its ordinary evening, and then its ordinary night, and then the slow burial begins, grain by grain, and the crowded river becomes a page of rock waiting for hands that will not exist for an unimaginably long time. And when those hands finally come, and brush the sand from a barbed sawfish tooth, or a straight conical fang, or the base of a spine that once rose more than 5 feet above a living back, they find only the stone, not the heat, not the smell of the water, not the sound of the giants moving through the shallows at dusk. All of that is beyond recovery, held nowhere now except in the shapes the minerals kept. The river giant and its whole crowded world have passed entirely out of the living present, leaving behind only the hardest, quietest evidence that any of it was ever real. First light does not arrive here so much as steep. It comes up slow through the humid air over the delta, a paling of the low sky along the eastern channels, and the water takes the colour before the land does. You are standing in imagination on a muddy bank 97 million years gone in the Nemanian, and the air is still cool from the night, thick and wet against the skin, carrying the smell of silt and rot and green growth. Somewhere out over the flats a pterosaur calls once and goes quiet. The river barely moves. Into that stillness a shape eases down the bank. It is enormous, and it does not hurry. This is Spinosaurus aegyptiacus, the longest predatory dinosaur anyone has ever dug from the ground, though how long exactly no one can tell you with confidence. The published estimates run from about 41 feet to over 49 feet, and one study pushed higher still to something like 53 to 59 feet, so the number you carry in your head is really a range, a soft cloud of possibility rather than a fixed fact. Whatever the true figure, the animal coming down to the water is longer than most rooms you have ever slept in, and it moves with the patience of a thing that has never needed to rush a morning. The sail comes first into the light. Along its back, the neural spines rise more than 5.5 feet from the vertebrae they grow out of, thin blades of bone standing more than 10 times taller than the bones are wide. What that sail was for, no one has settled. It may have shed or gathered heat. It may have been a banner for mates or a warning to rivals. It may have carried a ridge of fat the way a bison's hump rides its withers, or steadied the body in moving water like the fin of a sailfish. The honest answer is that all of these remain guesses, and the low sun does not care which is true. It simply lays a long band of pale gold along the top of that sail, and leaves the rest of the great body in shadow. The 4 feet touch the shallows. The mud here is soft as wet clay under the animal's weight, and the water is warm already, warmer than the air, holding the previous day's heat the way shallow water does. The giant wades out until the surface climbs its lower leg, and there it stops. Whether it will go deeper, whether it will ever swim, whether it dives after prey or only stands and waits, these are exactly the questions paleontologists have argued over for years, and the bones do not answer cleanly. So the animal in front of you does the honest thing. It stands where the evidence stands, at the edge, in the shallows, neither fully a swimmer nor fully a creature of the land, and it lowers its head toward the water. The head is a strange and specialized instrument. The skull runs somewhere between about 5 feet 2 and 5 feet 7 from back to snout tip, long and narrow, more like the jaws of a crocodile than the deep box skull of a land-hunting theropod. It is lined with teeth built for one job. They are straight and conical and smooth, without the steak knife serrations that other great carnivores use to saw through flesh. 6 or 7 sit in each side of the front of the upper jaw, and about a dozen more run back along each side behind them. These are not blades. They are pegs, hooks, gripping teeth, and the animal that owns them is not built to slice. It is built to hold. The snout tip settles onto the surface, or just beneath it, so gently that the water hardly stirs. And here the morning grows quiet in a way worth lingering over, because the hunt has already begun, and you cannot see it. Inside that snout near the tip, bone is riddled with tiny openings. A study that scanned the skull found these small holes, these foramina, running inward to a shared internal chamber, a structure the researchers read as a nest of pressure receptors, the same kind of sense that living crocodiles carry in the skin of their jaw. What it means is that the animal can feel the water. It can feel a disturbance in the water before its eyes ever find the source. A fish does not need to be seen to be known. Its tail beats, its small pulse of pressure moving out through the warm channel, arrives at the snout as information, a faint pushing against those buried nerves. So the giant waits with its head down and its eyes half idle, reading the river through its face, and the river is full. Somewhere out in the brighter water, a sawfish relative works the shallows. Onchopristis, a great cartilaginous animal that could reach perhaps 28 feet, its long snout studded with sideways barbs that it swept through the schooling fish. In the deeper channels, the coelacanths move. Mawsonia, heavy-bodied and slow, some of them past 5 feet. A few individuals possibly reaching more than 17. The chemistry of Spinosaurus teeth, the ratio of oxygen isotopes locked in the enamel, sits closer to that of turtles and crocodiles than to other dinosaurs, a quiet chemical signature of a life spent around water and the things that live in it. This is a fish-eater standing in a river thick with fish, and it has all morning. A tail beat reaches the snout, small, close, off to one side. If you have drifted off already, stay a moment for this, because it is the whole point of the scene, and it will be over almost before it starts. Follow or subscribe wherever you are listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice, and let the river carry you the rest of the way. The fish is there, a hand's breadth under the surface, unaware, its own small pulse announcing it to a sense it cannot imagine. The great head does not lunge. There is no dramatic plunge, no thrashing charge. There is only a short, exact drop of the jaws, a motion no bigger than it needs to be, and the smooth conical teeth close around the fish and hold. They hold rather than crush. The bite force here is modest for so large an animal, something on the order of 4,800 newtons at the front of the jaw, rising toward 12,000 toward the back, numbers that speak of gripping and not of shattering bone. And gripping is the hard part, because a live fish is the most difficult thing in the world to keep hold of. Picture it the way the animal must solve it. The fish in those jaws is like a wet bar of soap clamped in a closing hand, held just tightly enough that it cannot shoot free, and no tighter, because too much force would only launch it out the way a squeezed bar leaps from wet fingers. The smooth pegs of teeth press in on every side, the slick body strains and beats against them, and the grip finds exactly the pressure that traps it. That is what the whole strange head is for, not power, purchase. The head lifts. Water runs off the snout and off the fish in bright threads that catch the low sun for a second and then break. The fish moves once more, hard, and does not get free. A tilt of the jaws, a small working motion, and it turns and slides back and is gone down the long throat, and the surface of the channel closes over the place where it was as if nothing at all has happened. One fish, one breath of effort in a body that may weigh several tons, though even that number is uncertain, with estimates spread from around 4 metric tons to figures many times higher, depending on which bones and which method you trust. And then the great animal simply stands there. The morning is still early. The heat has begun to climb. You can feel it starting to lift off the mud and off the water, the humid air thickening as the sun clears the low vegetation. The giant does not leave. It stays at the water's edge with its feet in the warm shallows, its head lowered again toward the surface, reading, waiting, in no hurry to be anywhere, whether it will wade deeper as the day warms, whether it will lower its whole strange body into the channel, whether it can even do that safely, The bones will not say, and so the scene holds where the science holds, unresolved and unbothered, a huge patient shape at the margin of the water with the light strengthening along its sail. Around it the delta wakes fully into the heat. The pterosaurs are up now, wheeling and calling over the flats. Out on the drier ground beyond the tree line the other giants move. The land hunters, the ones that never come down to the water to feel for fish, and the shimmer rises off the floodplain behind them. But here, at the channel, the pace stays slow. The river runs its silt-brown course toward a sea that no longer exists. The fish move under the surface, unseen and sensed. The giant waits for the next small pulse against its face and takes the morning one quiet strike at a time, the way it has taken 10,000 mornings before this one, standing in warm water under a low sun in a world that will keep almost none of it. All of it is gone now, the river, the giants, the sail against the low sun, everything but the stone. All of it is gone now, the river, giants, the sail against the low sun, everything but the stone. So let the picture widen slowly, the way a held breath finally loosens. You are standing at the edge of that Cenomanian delta on its last quiet night, and the air is cooling over the slow water. The heat of the day is leaving the mud in thin, invisible threads. Near the banks the small voices start, the click and pulse of insects, the wet call of amphibians in the reeds, a sound that fills the dark without ever raising itself. Feel how still it becomes. The wide, silt-brown channels barely move. A last ripple crosses a lagoon and settles, and then the surface holds like poured glass. Somewhere out in the deeper water, a Mawsonia coelacanth turns, a slab of muscle 5 feet long or more, and the movement never reaches the shore. The barbed snout of an Onchopristis stops working the shallows. The pterosaurs have folded themselves against the higher branches, and the river giant, whatever it truly was, wading or swimming, is only a darker shape against the reeds now, sail lowered into the night, breath slow, waiting for a morning that will come and come again for a while, and then 1 year not for it. Let that be enough. You do not need to decide tonight what it was. Let the animal keep its argument and simply rest at the water it was built for. Now the years begin to move, and you can let them move gently. The floodplain floods as floodplains do. The channels shift and bury what they carried. A body settles into wet sand, and the sand becomes a weight, and the weight becomes a slow pressure that does not hurry anything. Water moved through the grain of bone, atom by patient atom, trading living tissue for mineral until the shape remains, and the substance has quietly changed hands. This is not a violent thing. It is the softest kind of keeping. The delta lies down over its own dead and holds them in the dark, and above, the seasons turn into centuries, and the centuries into something too large to feel. 97 million years is not a number you can hold, so do not try. Let it be a tide instead, coming in over the scene you have been watching, covering the reeds, the mud, the sail, until the surface of deep time is smooth and untroubled, and you cannot tell where the river was. The Tethys Sea advances and withdraws. The Sahara that will one day lie here is not yet even a rumour. Continents drift the width of oceans, slow as the hour hand you cannot catch moving, and through all of it, The buried delta simply waits, asking nothing, keeping its handful of bones the way a closed hand keeps warm. If you are still with me here at the end, follow or subscribe wherever you are listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice, so the next long night finds its way to you, and then let even that thought go quiet. Because the strange thing, the thing worth carrying down into sleep, is that the argument never really ended. The bones are still arguing. They argue in museum drawers and collection rooms, in trays lined with soft foam, under labels written in careful hand. One vertebra says the animal was longer than the largest meat-eater North America ever raised. Another set of measurements says it was smaller and heavier at the hips and could not have dived at all. A tale from Morocco says it swam. A study of its balance says it would have tipped and rolled. A sail rises more than 5 feet from spines 10 times the width of the bone beneath them, and no one can tell you with certainty what the sail was for. Eat, display, a hump of fat across the back, a fin to steady it in current. The evidence is real, and it points in more than one direction, and that is not a failure. That is what an honest science looks like while it is still working. Think of what these fragments have already survived. The first good bones came out of an Egyptian oasis, a jaw and teeth, and those metre-long spines lifted from the sand and shipped across a sea to a hall in Munich. And then, on a night in the spring of 1944, that hall and the only skeleton in the world burned together, and what remained of the longest predatory dinosaur ever found was a scatter of drawings, photographs, and one careful man's note. For 60 years that was nearly all. The animal had been discovered and then erased, present and then only remembered, and still it came back, not whole and not without doubt. It came back as a composite, gathered from 2 countries and 2 rock formations, argued over letter by letter, questioned even in its name, some researchers wondering whether all these bones belong to one creature at all. But it came back. That is the quiet miracle you can hold as you drift. A thing can be lost to fire and to time and to the slow indifference of 90-odd million years, and patient hands can still coax a shape of it back into the light, and then have the honesty to say, out loud, that they are not yet sure. So leave the debate where it lies, unsettled and safe. No one has to win it tonight. The fish-sensing snout and the paddle tail and the dense, heavy bones will still be there in the morning, in their drawers, waiting for the next measurement, the next model, the next young scientist who looks at a familiar bone and sees something no one noticed before. That is not a loose end. That is the thread staying alive. Now let the world pull away for good. Watch the delta grow small beneath you, the channels thinning to silver line, the reeds to a soft green haze, the whole warm country of the river giant shrinking until it is a single dim shape on the curve of a younger earth. It dims the way breath fades from a fogged window pane, the picture thinning at its edges first, then the middle going soft, then only the faint memory of where it was, and then the clear dark glass. You do not have to hold on to any of it. It has been held for 97 million years already, without you, and it will keep. Let your shoulders lower. Let the last of the day's weight go out of you the way heat left that cooling mud. There is nothing more to solve. The giant is at its river. The river is under its stone. The stone is patient beyond any patience you will ever need. And you're here, warm and still, at the far end of an almost unimaginable stretch of time, allowed simply to rest. Take one slow, easy breath, the kind that asks nothing of you. One unhurried deep breath, and let it out longer than you took it in. Feel how small and how safe this moment is inside all that vastness. Whatever is unfinished in the story below, the sand is not going to trouble your sleep. It waited a long time before anyone came for it. It can wait a little longer still. The insect voice is thin. The amphibian's quiet. The water holds its glass, and the long silence of deep time settles over the buried delta like a hand laid gently on a sleeping thing, asking nothing, keeping everything. Rest now. Let the river run in the dark without you. The sail stand against a sun that set an age ago. Let the bones keep their slow argument in their quiet drawers, and let it all grow dim and far and calm. Sleep well tonight, traveller. Good night.